200 guests, crystal chandeliers, a ballroom filled with people who had spent my entire life pretending I didn't exist. And there I was, sitting alone at the back table of my sister Rebecca's engagement party, wearing a simple black dress while she glittered in diamonds and designer silk. My father had told everyone I was the difficult one. My mother introduced Rebecca to guests and never mentioned she had a second daughter. For 18 years, I was the ghost in my own family, invisible, unwanted, never quite good enough. So when I left home at 18 with $187 and a bus ticket, no one came after me. No phone call, no text. They simply turned off the lights and went to sleep. That was 10 years ago. Tonight, Rebecca's fiancé, Daniel, stood at the microphone thanking the investors who had saved his company from bankruptcy. He displayed a logo on the screen, the company that had rescued him when he had nothing. And then he saw me. His face went white. His hands started shaking. He walked toward my table and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Wait, you're the founder." The room went silent. My mother's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. My father couldn't look at me. And Rebecca, perfect golden. Rebecca finally understood that the sister she had dismissed her entire life had been quietly building an empire. But here's what none of them knew. Yet the secrets I had discovered about my family would destroy everything they had built on lies. This is my story. Stay until the end, because the satisfying ending is worth every minute. My name is Jasmine, and I am 30 years old. Today, I am the founder and CEO of a technology company that helps thousands of small businesses across the country manage their operations. But before I built anything, before I proved anything, I was just a little girl sitting alone in her bedroom, wondering why her family seemed to forget she existed. The moment I realized I was invisible happened when I was 8 years old. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had just finished my homework early. I walked into the living room, hoping to show my mother my math test. I had gotten every problem correct, and the teacher had written, "Excellent work," in red ink at the top. But when I entered the room, I found my mother sitting on the couch with my older sister Rebecca, their heads bent together over Rebecca's textbook. Mother was explaining something about fractions, her voice patient and warm, in a way I rarely heard directed at me. I stood in the doorway holding my test paper, waiting for them to notice me. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, I said, "Mom, can I show you something?" My mother didn't look up. "Not now, Jasmine. Can't you see I'm helping your sister? Go finish your homework." "But I already finished. I got a perfect score on my—" "Then go clean your room. Rebecca needs to focus." I went back to my bedroom and put the test paper in my desk drawer. No one ever asked to see it. That evening established a pattern that would define the next 10 years of my life. Every night after dinner, Mother sat with Rebecca at the kitchen table, reviewing her assignments, quizzing her on vocabulary words, helping her prepare for tests. I did my homework alone in my room, teaching myself concepts I didn't understand by reading the textbook over and over until something clicked. When I had questions, I learned not to ask. Interrupting Rebecca's study time was treated as a serious offense. The grading system in our house operated on 2 completely different scales. When Rebecca brought home a B on her report card, Father stopped at the bakery on his way home from work and bought a chocolate cake to celebrate. "You're working so hard," he told her, cutting her the largest slice. "We're so proud of you." When I brought home straight A's the following week, Father glanced at my report card, handed it back, and said only, "Don't get arrogant. Pride comes before a fall." There was no cake. There was no celebration. There was just a warning not to think too highly of myself. At dinner, the conversation revolved around Rebecca like planets orbiting the sun. What happened in Rebecca's classes, what Rebecca's friends said at lunch, what Rebecca thought about the news. I would sit quietly eating my food occasionally, trying to contribute something about my own day. But whenever I opened my mouth, Mother would hold up her hand and say, "Let your sister finish first." By the time Rebecca finished, the topic had changed and no one remembered I had wanted to speak at all. The favoritism wasn't a secret kept within our walls. It was public knowledge that spread to relatives, neighbors, and family friends. During holiday gatherings, Mother would hold court in the living room, telling guests about Rebecca's latest accomplishments. "She's so talented," Mother would say, beaming. "Her teacher says she's the best student in the class." Aunts and uncles would nod approvingly, and Rebecca would smile modestly while accepting their compliments. No one asked about me. If they did, Mother would give a vague answer, "Oh, Jasmine is fine," and change the subject back to Rebecca. The division of labor in our house reflected the division of value. Rebecca was assigned to entertain visitors, to sit in the living room and charm guests with conversation. I was sent to the kitchen to help cook, to wash dishes, to clean up after everyone else had finished enjoying themselves. When I was 11, I asked my mother if I could join the science club at school. Several of my classmates were members, and they had been working on a project about solar energy that fascinated me. Mother refused immediately. "No need for that," she said, not even looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "You should focus on helping around the house. Your sister has enough activities for both of you." Slowly, insidiously, I began to believe what my family was telling me without words. I was less important, less talented, less worthy of attention and investment. It wasn't that I had evidence of my inferiority. My grades were actually higher than Rebecca's, and my teachers often praised my work. But external validation couldn't compete with the daily message delivered by the people who were supposed to love me most. When your own family treats you as an afterthought, you start to believe you deserve to be forgotten. Then came the afternoon that still confuses me even now. I was 12 years old, and a girl named Hannah had been tormenting me for months. She spread rumors that I was dirty, that I smelled bad, that my family was poor. She pushed me in the hallways between classes and knocked my books out of my hands. I never told anyone because I had learned that my problems didn't matter enough to discuss. One afternoon, Hannah cornered me behind the gymnasium. She had 2 friends with her, and they were blocking my escape. Hannah was saying something cruel. I don't remember the exact words anymore, when suddenly Rebecca appeared. My sister, who had never shown any interest in protecting me, who had learned to treat me with the same dismissive indifference as our parents, stepped between me and Hannah. "Leave her alone," Rebecca said, her voice hard. Hannah laughed. "Or what?" What happened next shocked everyone, including me. Rebecca shoved Hannah so hard that she fell backward onto the ground. When Hannah's friends moved toward us, Rebecca stood her ground and said, "Try it, I dare you." They didn't try it. They helped Hannah up and retreated, throwing threats over their shoulders that everyone knew were empty. Rebecca watched them go, then turned to me. For one brief, shining moment, she looked like the sister I had always wanted. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. My heart was pounding with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe Rebecca did care about me. Maybe things could change. That evening, I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. I even smiled at Rebecca across the dinner table, and she gave me a small nod in return. I went to bed believing that I finally had an ally in my own home. But later that night, I woke up thirsty and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. As I passed my parents' bedroom, I heard voices through the partially open door. I stopped and listened. It was Mother speaking to Rebecca in a low, intense tone I had never heard before. "You must always stay on top," Mother was saying. "Do you understand me? Everything depends on you. Everything. You cannot let anything distract you from being the best. Not school drama, not your sister, nothing. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mom," Rebecca replied quietly. "Good. Now go to bed. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." I crept back to my room without getting water, my brief happiness evaporating like morning dew. I didn't fully understand what I had heard. I was only 12, but I understood enough. Rebecca's protection that afternoon had been an anomaly, a momentary break from a role she had been assigned. Mother had just reminded her of the script. After that night, Rebecca changed. She never defended me again. She never acknowledged me in the hallways at school. She settled into the pattern our parents had designed. She was the star, and I was the shadow. Whatever sisterly connection had flickered to life that afternoon behind the gymnasium was extinguished permanently. That was the last time Jasmine ever felt she had a sister. The years between 12 and 18 passed in a blur of quiet desperation. I learned to make myself small, to take up as little space as possible, to need nothing from anyone. When I was 16, I asked my parents for money to take an SAT prep course. Several of my classmates were enrolled, and I knew the test would determine my college options. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. "We don't have money for that," he said, even though I knew they had just paid for Rebecca's private tutoring sessions. My mother added, "You'll do fine without it. You always manage somehow." I did manage. I checked out SAT prep books from the library and studied alone in my room every night for 6 months. I scored higher than Rebecca had, but no one acknowledged it. My birthdays became non-events. Rebecca's 18th birthday was celebrated with a party, 30 guests, a catered dinner, a cake with her name written in pink frosting. When my 18th birthday arrived 3 years later, my mother forgot entirely. I came downstairs that morning hoping for at least a card, but breakfast proceeded as usual. No one mentioned the date. That evening, when I reminded my mother, she looked momentarily embarrassed and said, "Oh, right. Happy birthday. We'll do something next week." Next week never came. 3 days after that forgotten birthday, I made my decision. I had saved $187 over the years, birthday money from a distant aunt coins found in couch cushions, small amounts earned from occasional odd jobs. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I packed a small suitcase with clothes and a few books. I wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table where someone would find it in the morning. I'm going to find my own life. I walked out the front door at 9 o'clock in the evening and headed to the bus station 6 blocks away. The night air was cool, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I walked. Part of me expected to hear footsteps behind me, to hear my mother's voice calling me back, to feel my father's hand on my shoulder. I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting for someone to come after me. At the bus station, I bought a ticket to a city 3 hours away, far enough to feel like escape, close enough to afford. Then I sat on the bench and waited. 30 minutes passed. I watched the street, watched the occasional car drive by, watched the moths circling the streetlights. No one came. My phone stayed silent. No calls, no text messages, no indication that anyone had noticed I was gone. From where I sat, I could see my family's house in the distance, perched on the hill at the end of our street. As I watched the lights turned off one by one, first the kitchen, then the living room, then the upstairs bedrooms. By 10 o'clock, the house was completely dark. My family had gone to sleep as if nothing had happened, as if their daughter hadn't just walked out of their lives. I boarded the bus with that image burned into my mind, the dark house, the sleeping family, the absolute indifference to my existence. The city I arrived in at midnight was nothing like I had imagined. I had pictured opportunity, fresh starts, the beginning of something better. Instead, I found myself standing on an unfamiliar street corner with a suitcase and no plan. I had nowhere to sleep. I knew no one. The cheap motels I passed wanted more per night than I could afford to spend. I walked for hours, dragging my suitcase behind me, growing more exhausted and more frightened with every block. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself on a bridge over the river that cut through the downtown area. I had stopped walking because my feet hurt and because I had nowhere left to go. The bridge was empty at that hour, no cars, no pedestrians, just me and the sound of water rushing below. I leaned against the railing and looked down. The water was black, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. It looked cold and deep and final. I don't know how long I stood there. Time stopped having meaning. My mind emptied out completely, no thoughts about the past, no fears about the future, no awareness of anything except the railing under my hands and the darkness below. I felt like I was already gone, already disappeared, already forgotten. My family hadn't come after me. No one in this city knew I existed. If I simply stopped existing entirely, would anyone notice? Would anyone care? I climbed over the railing. I stood on the narrow ledge on the other side, my back pressed against the metal bars, my hands gripping the cold steel behind me. The wind picked up, cutting through my thin jacket. I looked down at the water again. I wasn't crying. I wasn't scared. I felt nothing at all, and that emptiness was somehow worse than any emotion I had ever experienced. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Young lady, have you eaten anything?" I turned my head. An old woman had stopped her cart on the bridge, one of those carts that street vendors use to sell food late at night. She was small and wrinkled, wrapped in a heavy coat, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't threatening to call the police. She wasn't demanding to know what I was doing or why I was there. She was simply asking if I had eaten. "What?" I managed to say. She held out a small packet wrapped in banana leaves. "Sticky rice," she said. "Still warm. You should eat something. You can't think straight when you're hungry." I stared at her. Of all the things I had expected to happen on that bridge, and I had expected nothing really except the end, a stranger offering me sticky rice was not among them. Something about the absurdity of the moment, the simple practicality of her concern, broke through the numbness that had frozen me. I climbed back over the railing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the bars. The old woman didn't try to help me or touch me. She just waited, patient and calm, until I was standing on the safe side of the bridge again. Then she pressed the warm packet into my hands. I burst into tears. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ugly, heaving sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for my forgotten birthdays and my invisible achievements. I cried for the sister who had stopped defending me and the parents who had never started. I cried for the 18 years I had spent believing I was worthless because the people who should have loved me told me so every single day. The old woman didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations or offer advice. She simply stood beside me while I cried, occasionally patting my arm, waiting for the storm to pass. When I finally quieted down, she nodded toward the sticky rice in my hands. "Eat," she said. "Then figure out what comes next." I ate. The rice was warm and slightly sweet, and it was the first thing I had eaten in almost 24 hours. As I chewed, I felt something shift inside me, a tiny spark of determination flickering to life in the darkness. This stranger, this old woman I had never met, had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than my family had shown me in 18 years. If a stranger could care whether I lived or died, then maybe my family's judgment wasn't the final word on my value. I never learned that old woman's name. When I finished eating, she simply nodded, wished me luck, and continued pushing her cart across the bridge. I watched her go until she disappeared into the night. From that night forward, Jasmine made a vow no one would ever decide her worth again. The morning after the bridge, I woke up on a bench in the bus station where I had spent the remaining hours of the night. My neck ached, my back was stiff, and my suitcase had become a makeshift pillow that left zipper marks on my cheek. But I was alive. I had chosen to be alive, and now I had to figure out how to stay that way. I found a job within 3 days waiting tables at a diner called Lucky's that was neither lucky nor particularly clean. The owner hired me because I showed up early, didn't complain, and agreed to work for minimum wage plus tips. The tips were meager, barely enough to cover the cost of eating one meal a day from the diner's kitchen. The customers were mostly truckers passing through and elderly regulars who ordered coffee and stayed for hours. I learned to smile even when my feet were screaming to remember orders without writing them down to apologize for mistakes that weren't my fault. I learned that survival required swallowing pride in doses I hadn't known were possible. The diner job covered daylight hours, but daylight hours alone wouldn't pay for a room. After 2 weeks of sleeping in the bus station and washing up in public restrooms, I found a second job working the overnight reception desk at a budget motel on the edge of town. The motel attracted a specific clientele, people who paid by the hour, travelers too tired or too cheap for anywhere better, and occasional drunks who stumbled in demanding rooms they couldn't afford. My responsibilities included checking guests in and out, answering the phone, and dealing with whatever problems arose between midnight and 7 in the morning. Broken air conditioners, clogged toilets, domestic disputes loud enough to wake neighboring rooms. I handled all of it night after night because the job came with a crucial benefit, a tiny storage closet with a cot where I could sleep for 4 hours between my shifts. 4 hours of sleep became my new normal. I finished at the motel at 7, walked to the diner to start at 8, worked until 4 in the afternoon, then returned to the motel to start again at midnight. The 8 hours between my shifts were supposed to be for rest, but rest was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I used that time to plan to learn to build something that might eventually lift me out of this exhausting cycle. My diet consisted almost entirely of instant noodles and eggs, the cheapest sources of calories I could find. I bought noodles in bulk from a discount grocery store and kept them in my storage closet at the motel. Eggs I got from the diner slightly past their sell-by date, but still edible. I ate the same thing every day for months. Noodles for breakfast, an egg sandwich for lunch, more noodles for dinner. When I got sick, often worn down by exhaustion and poor nutrition, I bought the cheapest medicine from the pharmacy and worked through the fever. Missing a shift meant losing money I couldn't spare. Through all of this, I never called home. Not once. Not when I was so tired I could barely see straight. Not when I was sick and alone and frightened. Not when the loneliness became so heavy I felt like I was drowning in it. I knew that calling home would accomplish nothing except confirming what my family already believed, that I was a failure who couldn't survive without them. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I refused to prove them right. What saved me during those brutal first years was the public library. It was free to enter, warm in winter, cool in summer, and filled with books that could teach me everything I needed to know. I went there every afternoon between my shifts and educated myself with the same determination I had once applied to homework that no one checked. I read books on personal finance, learning how to budget and save and invest. I read books on marketing, studying how businesses attracted and retained customers. I read books on retail management, understanding inventory and pricing and customer service. I read biographies of entrepreneurs who had started with nothing and built empires. I took notes in cheap spiral notebooks, filling page after page with ideas and strategies and plans. One afternoon, I discovered that a local electronics store was holding a clearance sale. Among the damaged items they were selling at deep discounts was a laptop with a cracked screen and a broken keyboard. The price was $60, nearly a week's worth of tips from the diner. I bought it anyway. I spent the next 2 weeks teaching myself to repair it using YouTube videos I watched on the library computers. When I finally got it working, I felt like I had conquered something vast. That laptop became my most valuable possession. I used it to write my first business plan, sitting in the shared hallway of the boarding house where I had eventually managed to rent a tiny room. My room had no electricity that month. I hadn't been able to pay the bill, so I worked in the hallway, typing by the light of the single bulb that illuminated the corridor. Other tenants stepped over me as they came and went. I didn't care. I was building something even if no one else could see it yet. By my third year in the city, my persistence began to attract attention. I had taken to visiting small businesses and offering suggestions for how they might improve their operations, free advice based on everything I had been reading. Most owners ignored me, but one didn't. He ran a small logistics company and was impressed enough by my ideas to offer me a job. The position was entry-level. The salary was modest, but it was a chance to learn how a real business operated from the inside. I threw myself into that job with everything I had. I arrived early and stayed late. I volunteered for tasks no one else wanted, organizing the filing system, reconciling expense reports, sitting in on meetings where I was expected to take notes but not speak. My manager called me obsessive, and he wasn't wrong. I was obsessed with learning, with proving myself, with building skills that would eventually become my foundation. While other employees rushed out at 5 o'clock, I stayed behind, checking numbers, studying how the different departments connected, understanding the machinery of commerce. The salary was low, but I saved every dollar I didn't absolutely need to spend. I continued eating cheaply, living in my tiny room, avoiding any expense that wasn't essential. My savings account grew slowly but steadily, each deposit representing hours of work and sacrifice. I didn't know exactly what I was saving for, only that I was preparing for something bigger. 3 years later, Jasmine decided to bet everything she had saved on starting her own business. Starting my own business felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. I was 21 years old, with 6 years of survival behind me, and a savings account containing every dollar I hadn't spent on rent, food, or absolute necessities. The amount wasn't impressive by any business standard, but to me, it represented thousands of hours of work, countless skipped meals, and years of sacrifice. I was about to bet all of it on myself. My idea seemed solid at the time. I would launch an online store selling household goods, kitchen appliances, cookware, small furniture items. I had noticed that many similar stores charged premium prices for products that weren't particularly special. If I could find suppliers offering lower prices and pass those savings to customers, I could carve out a profitable niche. I spent weeks researching suppliers, comparing prices, and building a simple website using skills I had taught myself from library books and online tutorials. The supplier I eventually chose was based overseas and offered prices that seemed almost too good to be true. Blenders that retailed for $80 elsewhere cost me $15. Cooking pots that competitors sold for $60 were available for $8. Folding tables priced at $120 everywhere else could be mine for $25. I should have recognized the warning signs. Prices that low usually mean quality that low, but I was blinded by the profit margins dancing in my head. I placed a large order using nearly all my savings, rented a small warehouse space to store the inventory, and launched my store with excitement and hope. The first week went beautifully. Orders came in faster than I had anticipated. Customers were attracted by my competitive prices, and I rushed to fulfill shipments, imagining the positive reviews that would soon flood in and drive even more sales. I allowed myself to dream about expanding, about hiring employees, about building something real and lasting. Those dreams lasted exactly 12 days. Then the complaints started arriving. A customer reported that her blender had sparked and caught fire the first time she plugged it in. Another said his cooking pot's handle had snapped off while he was carrying it to the table, spilling hot soup across his kitchen floor. A third described how the folding table she had purchased for her daughter's birthday party collapsed during dinner, sending cake and presents crashing to the ground. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. The products I had bought at impossibly low prices were impossibly low quality. I had built my business on a foundation of defective merchandise. The refund requests flooded in daily. I processed them as quickly as I could, apologizing profusely and returning money I had already mentally allocated to rent and operating costs. Negative reviews accumulated on my store page, each one a public declaration of my failure. Within 3 weeks, my rating had dropped so low that new customers wouldn't even consider purchasing. Within 6 weeks, the orders stopped coming entirely. By week 12, I couldn't cover my basic operating expenses. The warehouse fees were due, my credit card had hit its maximum limit, and I had no way to pay either. I sat alone in my tiny apartment, surrounded by boxes of defective products I couldn't sell, and confronted the full scope of my failure. I had lost everything I had spent years saving. I had embarrassed myself publicly with a store that now served as a monument to my incompetence. I was worse off than when I had started. At least back then I didn't have debt collectors calling my phone. In that moment of desperation, I did something I had sworn I would never do. I called home. My father answered on the third ring. When I explained my situation carefully, trying to sound calm rather than panicked, I heard him exhale slowly the way he always did before delivering a lecture. "I told you so," he said, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "You're not cut out for business. Some people just aren't." My mother was listening on the other extension. I could hear her breathing. But she said nothing. No words of comfort, no offer of help. Just silence that confirmed everything I had always suspected about my place in that family. I asked if they could lend me money just enough to pay the warehouse fees and avoid bankruptcy. The amount I needed was modest, less than what they had spent on Rebecca's graduation party. My father's response was immediate and final. "We're not throwing good money after bad. You made this mess. You clean it up." He hung up without saying goodbye. Later that evening, Rebecca sent a text message. "Mom told me what happened. Maybe you should find something more stable. Not everyone is meant to take risks." The message included a link to job listings at a local grocery store, as if my entire ambition should now be reduced to stocking shelves. I stared at that text for a long time, feeling something harden inside me. My family's response had removed any lingering doubt about where I stood with them. I was alone. I had always been alone. The only difference now was that I understood it completely. To pay my most pressing debts, I sold my laptop, the one I had bought broken for $60, and painstakingly repaired with my own hands. Letting it go felt like selling a piece of myself, but I had no choice. The laptop brought enough to cover the warehouse fees and some of my credit card balance. The rest I would have to work off. But I refused to let this failure define me. Instead, I sat down with a notebook and wrote a detailed list of every mistake I had made. First, I had chosen my supplier based solely on price, without investigating quality or reputation. Second, I had failed to sign proper contracts that would protect me if products were defective. Third, I had invested nearly all my capital in inventory without keeping cash reserves for emergencies. Fourth, I had not tested the products myself before selling them to customers. I wrote these lessons on a clean sheet of paper and hung it on my wall where I would see it every morning. Those mistakes had cost me $15,000 and 3 years of savings. I intended to make sure I never repeated them. I returned to working multiple jobs, taking every shift I could get. The motel hired me back for overnight reception. I found a second job washing dishes at a restaurant. Every extra dollar went toward paying off my remaining debt. 6 months later, I was back to zero, no savings, but also no debt hanging over me. I had climbed out of the hole I had dug for myself. On the day I made my final debt payment, I decided to write about what I had learned. The article was called, "I Lost $15,000 to Learn These 3 Lessons." And I posted it on LinkedIn with my real name attached. I described my failure, honestly explained what I had done wrong, and shared what I had learned. I expected maybe a few people would read it. I expected nothing to change. That article would change her life, though she didn't know it yet. The message arrived 3 weeks after I posted my article. I had mostly forgotten about it by then, having returned to the grinding rhythm of double shifts and careful budgeting. The LinkedIn notification surprised me. My account was sparse, used mainly for job searching rather than networking. When I opened the message, I found a brief note from someone named Robert Hale. "I read your article about your business failure. I would like to meet with you to discuss your experience. Please let me know if you have time for coffee this week." I researched him before responding, expecting to find either a scammer or a salesman. What I found instead was impressive and slightly intimidating. Robert Hale was a 55-year-old investor with a track record spanning 3 decades. He had built and sold 2 companies, now managed a portfolio of investments in small and medium businesses, and occasionally mentored promising entrepreneurs. His photograph showed a man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they observed. There was no obvious reason why someone like him would be interested in someone like me, a 21-year-old with a failed online store and no credentials to speak of. I agreed to meet him anyway. If nothing else, I might learn something. The coffee shop he chose was quiet and upscale, the kind of place where business people conducted meetings over expensive lattes. I arrived early and sat at a corner table rehearsing answers to questions I imagined he might ask. When Robert walked in, he spotted me immediately and came over with a confident stride that spoke of decades spent commanding rooms. He shook my hand firmly, ordered black coffee for both of us without asking my preference, and began the strangest job interview I had ever experienced. He didn't ask about my education or my work history. He didn't want to hear my elevator pitch or my 5-year plan. Instead, he asked detailed questions about my failed business questions that went far deeper than surface-level curiosity. "Walk me through your supplier selection process," he said. "What criteria did you use? Did you request samples before placing your bulk order?" I admitted I hadn't requested samples, that I had been seduced by the low prices and hadn't thought carefully enough about what those prices implied. Robert nodded and continued. "Tell me about your cash flow projections. How much runway did you have when you launched? What was your break-even point?" I explained that I had calculated my break-even point based on optimistic sales estimates and hadn't accounted for the possibility of mass returns. I had given myself no cushion, no margin for error. Robert wrote something in a small notebook, his expression unreadable. The questions kept coming for over an hour. Customer acquisition costs, marketing channels, pricing strategy, contract terms with the warehouse. Each question revealed another gap in my preparation, another mistake I had made. But I answered everyone honestly, without making excuses or deflecting blame. I had failed because of my own decisions, and I said so directly. I noticed Robert watching me carefully as I spoke, as if he were evaluating not just my answers, but how I delivered them. When he finally finished his interrogation, he sat back and studied me for a long moment. "Most young people I meet want to skip straight to the success part," he said. "They don't want to hear about process or fundamentals. They want money and they want it now." He paused. "You haven't asked me for money once. Why not?" The question caught me off guard. "Because money wouldn't help me right now," I said after thinking about it. "I don't know enough yet. If you gave me $100,000 today, I would probably find new ways to lose it. What I need is to understand what I'm doing wrong. I need someone to tell me what I don't know." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I want you to complete an assignment for me," he said. "Create a 3-month sales strategy for a hypothetical product. I'll give you the product specifications and target market. You'll submit weekly progress reports showing your work, your reasoning, and your revisions based on feedback I provide. This is not a paid position. This is a test." I took the folder without hesitation. Most people in my situation would have been disappointed they had expected investment, or at least a job offer. But I understood what Robert was offering. He was willing to teach me to share knowledge that couldn't be found in library books. That was worth more than money. Over the next 3 months, I worked on that assignment like my life depended on it. Every week, I submitted detailed reports showing my research, my strategy, and my projections. Every week, Robert sent back feedback that was thorough and often harsh. He pointed out assumptions I had made without evidence, projections based on wishful thinking rather than data strategies that looked good on paper but would fail in practice. Each critique stung, but each one also taught me something valuable. I revised my work constantly, incorporating his feedback, pushing myself to think more rigorously. When the 3 months ended, Robert invited me back to the same coffee shop. He reviewed my final submission in silence, while I waited nervously, wondering if I had passed or failed. Finally, he looked up. "You need experience before you need capital," he said. "Join my consulting team. The salary is low, but you'll learn how real businesses operate at scale. You'll see what works and what doesn't from the inside. If you're as serious as you seem to be, this will be worth more than any investment I could make in you." I accepted without negotiation. The salary he mentioned was barely above minimum wage, less than I had made combining my diner and motel jobs. But I understood the opportunity he was offering. I would learn from someone who had actually built successful companies, who understood the mechanics of business in ways I was only beginning to grasp. I would finally have a mentor. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was why Robert had really reached out to me. I didn't know that when he read my article, something about my family name had caught his attention. I didn't know that he had encountered that name before years ago, in circumstances that had cost him dearly. I didn't know that he had spent the last decade searching for anyone connected to that name, looking for answers to questions that had haunted him since a fraud had destroyed his first major investment. I didn't know that his interest in me was more complicated than simple mentorship. I only knew that someone was finally willing to teach me. For now, that was enough. Robert had been looking for someone with that family name for over a decade, but he never told Jasmine why. Working for Robert transformed how I understood business. His consulting firm operated differently from anything I had experienced. They didn't just advise companies from a distance, but embedded themselves deeply in their clients' operations, understanding problems from the inside before proposing solutions. I started as the lowest member of the team, taking notes in meetings, organizing files, and observing how experienced consultants analyze struggling businesses. Every day taught me something new. I watched how they identified inefficiencies that company owners couldn't see, how they communicated difficult truths without alienating the people who needed to hear them, how they balanced short-term fixes with long-term strategy. After 18 months of learning, I began noticing patterns that others seemed to overlook. Many of Robert's clients were small retail businesses, family-owned stores, local shops, independent groceries. They shared a common problem that kept appearing in meeting after meeting: inventory management was destroying them. These weren't sophisticated operations with dedicated logistics teams. They were run by hard-working people who tracked their stock using spreadsheets, handwritten notebooks, or pure guesswork. They ordered too much of products that didn't sell and ran out of products that customers wanted. They lost money to spoilage theft and simple disorganization. The enterprise software solutions that existed were designed for large corporations and priced accordingly far beyond what a family grocery store could afford. I brought the idea to Robert during one of our weekly meetings. What if someone created inventory management software specifically for small businesses? Something affordable, intuitive, and focused on their actual needs rather than overwhelming them with features they would never use. Robert listened carefully, asked his usual probing questions, then told me something I hadn't expected. If you think you can build it, build it. I'll give you guidance, but this has to be yours. I spent the next 6 months developing the software. I couldn't code myself, but I found a freelance developer willing to work for equity in a company that didn't exist yet. I described exactly what the software needed to do, based on everything I had learned from watching small businesses struggle. The interface had to be simple enough that someone with no technical background could use it within an hour. The system needed to track inventory in real time, predict when items would run low based on historical sales patterns, and automate reorders when stock dropped below specified thresholds. Nothing revolutionary, just practical solutions to practical problems. My first client was a family-owned grocery store called Park's Market. The owner, Mr. Park, was a 60-year-old Korean immigrant who had been running his store for 25 years using the same handwritten ledger system his father had taught him. He was drowning in spreadsheets his daughter had tried to set up, losing track of what sold and what spoiled, and watching his profits shrink every month. I offered him a free 3-month trial of my software in exchange for honest feedback about what worked and what didn't. The results exceeded my most optimistic projections. Within 1 month, Park's Market had reduced its inventory losses by 40%. Mr. Park could see exactly what was selling, what was sitting on shelves, and what needed to be reordered. He stopped over-ordering perishables that went bad before they could be sold. He identified which products were actually profitable rather than just guessing. At the end of the trial, he insisted on becoming a paying customer, and then he told 3 other store owners in his community about what the software had done for his business. Word spread organically through the small business networks that I hadn't known existed. Store owners talked to each other at community meetings at church, at their children's schools. One satisfied customer led to introductions to others who faced the same problems. I didn't spend money on advertising because I didn't have money to spend. My growth came entirely from people telling other people that my software actually worked. I made a strategic decision during this period that Robert strongly endorsed. I would never sell my software outright. Instead, I licensed it through annual subscription contracts while retaining complete ownership of the code and intellectual property. The subscription model meant lower upfront payments from clients, but it created something more valuable recurring revenue that I could predict and depend on. A client who paid me monthly was a client who stayed connected, who received updates and improvements, who became part of an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time transaction. My lawyer paid for, with my first real profits, drafted contracts with strong protection clauses that ensured my ownership could never be challenged. Within 6 months, 10 stores had signed agreements. Within a year, that number had grown to 50. The revenue wasn't spectacular by startup standards. I wasn't going to appear on any magazine covers as a young billionaire. But for the first time in my life, I had financial stability built entirely by my own hands. I could pay my bills without anxiety. I could plan for the future without wondering if I would survive the present. I could breathe. At 25, I moved into a modest but clean apartment in a safe neighborhood, my first real home since leaving my family at 18. The space wasn't large, but it had good light and working appliances and walls that felt like mine. I bought a new laptop, a proper desk, and furniture that hadn't been salvaged from sidewalks or purchased at thrift stores. I was building a life piece by piece that belonged only to me. I also made another decision that had nothing to do with business. I hired a private investigator to find the old woman who had saved my life on the bridge 7 years earlier. I had never forgotten her, the sticky rice cart, the simple question about whether I had eaten the patience with which she had waited while I cried. I wanted to thank her properly now that I had the means to do so. The investigator warned me that street vendors were difficult to locate. They moved constantly, had no fixed addresses, and often operated outside official systems. I told him to keep looking no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, I was reviewing a list of companies that had inquired about partnering with my software when a name stopped me cold. One of the businesses requesting integration was a retail chain that employed someone I recognized, my father. He had apparently taken a position there after leaving his previous job. The company wanted my inventory management system for their regional operations. They had no idea that the software they needed belonged to the daughter their colleague had dismissed as a failure. Her father had no idea his daughter now controlled something he desperately needed. The discovery happened by accident, the way so many life-altering revelations do. Robert had given me a stack of reference materials to review bankruptcy files from companies in our industry that had failed over the past 2 decades. He wanted me to study their mistakes to understand how businesses that seemed stable could collapse suddenly when their foundations were rotten. It was exactly the kind of assignment he loved, giving practical education disguised as paperwork. I took the files home and spent the weekend reading through them, taking notes on patterns of mismanagement and fraud. The third file in the stack was for a company called Eastbrook Trading. According to the summary, it had been a mid-sized retail distribution firm that collapsed 15 years ago after investigators discovered years of financial manipulation, falsified invoices, hidden debts, fake transactions designed to make the company appear profitable when it was actually hemorrhaging money. The owner had used personal funds to settle with creditors, quietly avoiding a public trial that would have exposed everyone involved. The company was liquidated, the employees scattered, and the whole affair faded into the kind of business failure that becomes a footnote in industry history. I almost set the file aside without reading further. Then I saw my father's name. He was listed as the company director during the period of fraud. My father, the man who had lectured me about discipline and responsibility, who had told me I wasn't cut out for business, who had refused to lend me money when I was drowning in debt from my own failed venture. He had been at the helm of a company that had collapsed due to financial crimes. The hypocrisy was staggering, but not entirely surprising. I had always known my father was capable of cruelty. Learning he was also capable of fraud simply added another layer to my understanding of who he really was. But then I turned the page and saw something that stopped my breathing entirely. The signature authorizing the fraudulent transactions wasn't my father's. The name on every falsified invoice, every hidden debt transfer, every fake transaction was someone else's. Someone I knew, someone I had lived with for 18 years. The signature belonged to my mother. I read the name 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding, but the documents were clear. My mother had been Eastbrook Trading's chief accountant. Her signature appeared on every piece of paperwork that had enabled the fraud. She had approved the fake invoices. She had hidden the debts. She had created the paper trail that made the company look healthy while it was rotting from within. My father had been the public face, the director who glad-handed clients and represented the company at meetings. But my mother had controlled the numbers. My mother had made the fraud possible. I spent the next several days digging deeper into the public bankruptcy records. The documents had been released during liquidation proceedings and were available to anyone who knew where to look. No one had bothered to examine them closely in 15 years because the case had been settled privately, without prosecution, without publicity. But the evidence was all there for anyone willing to read through hundreds of pages of financial records. The picture that emerged was devastating. My mother had been running Eastbrook's finances for nearly a decade before its collapse. She had designed the system of falsification from the ground up, creating shell accounts and fake vendors that existed only on paper. The fraud wasn't a desperate act committed during a crisis. It was a methodical, long-term operation that required intelligence planning and complete lack of conscience. When the scheme finally unraveled, my mother's role was buried beneath layers of corporate paperwork. The owner took the public blame and used his wealth to make the problem disappear. My father lost his position but faced no legal consequences. My mother escaped entirely, her involvement invisible to anyone who didn't study the fine print. I sat alone in my office for hours after finishing the files, unable to process what I had learned. My entire childhood I had understood my family through a specific lens. Father was the authority, the decision-maker, the source of the coldness that permeated our home. Mother was passive-submissive, a woman who went along with her husband's choices because she lacked the power to resist. When Mother stayed silent during my father's criticisms of me, I had assumed it was weakness, an inability to stand up for her daughter against a domineering spouse. Now I understood that I had been completely wrong. Mother wasn't weak. Mother was calculating. Every time she had stayed silent while Father dismissed me, it wasn't because she couldn't speak. It was because speaking would have drawn attention to herself, would have disrupted the careful balance she maintained to protect her secrets. Her passivity wasn't a flaw, it was a strategy. She had hidden behind Father's cruelty, letting him absorb all the blame for their family's dysfunction, while she operated invisibly in the background. The question that haunted me was why? Why had Mother needed to hide? What was she protecting so fiercely that she had been willing to sacrifice her own daughter's happiness to maintain her cover? The fraud had happened 15 years ago when I was just a child. The case was closed, the company dissolved, the principals scattered. What could possibly still require such elaborate concealment? I thought about all the times Mother had diverted attention toward Rebecca and away from me. I thought about the whispered conversation I had overheard at 12 years old, when Mother had told Rebecca that everything depended on her. I thought about the years of invisibility, the systematic erasure of my existence from our family's narrative. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been simple favoritism. Mother had been running a long game that I was only now beginning to perceive. I didn't know yet what that game was. I didn't know what other secrets my mother was hiding or how deep her deceptions ran. But I knew that the woman who had raised me was not the woman I had believed her to be. The passive, defeated mother of my childhood memories was a fiction, a mask worn by someone far more dangerous and far more deliberate. If Mother was the mastermind, then everything Jasmine believed about her family was a lie. The discovery about my mother's role in the Eastbrook fraud left me with more questions than answers. If she had been capable of orchestrating financial crimes for years, what else had she hidden? What other lies had formed the foundation of my family? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing only the surface of something much deeper, that the fraud was just one thread in a web of deception I had never suspected existed. I needed to understand the full picture, and I couldn't do that alone. I hired a professional researcher who specialized in examining public records. He came recommended by my lawyer, a discreet man who asked no questions about why I wanted to investigate my own family. I gave him names, dates, and locations, and asked him to find anything that existed in official documentation. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property records, court filings, anything that might reveal the truth behind the family I thought I knew. The findings arrived 3 weeks later in a plain manila envelope. I opened it at my desk after everyone else had left the office wanting privacy for whatever I was about to learn. The first few documents were unremarkable. My parents' marriage certificate from 1993 property records for the house I grew up in, routine paperwork that confirmed facts I already knew. Then I found Rebecca's birth certificate. The document was dated 1992, 1 year before my parents married. It listed my mother's name and an address I didn't recognize. The space for the father's name was blank, marked only with the word unknown. I stared at that empty space for a long time, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I had believed about my family. Rebecca had been born before my parents were together. Rebecca's father was someone other than the man I had grown up calling father. I kept reading. The next document was an adoption certificate filed in 1994, 1 year after my parents' wedding. It showed my father legally adopting Rebecca, giving her his surname, establishing himself as her father in the eyes of the law. The birth certificate I had seen growing up, the one that listed both my parents' names, wasn't Rebecca's original record. It was a replacement issued after the adoption designed to make Rebecca appear as if she had always been their child together. The timeline crystallized in my mind with painful clarity. My mother had given birth to Rebecca at 24, unmarried, with no father listed on the certificate. She had been young, possibly struggling, certainly lacking the social respectability that mattered in the circles she would later inhabit. When she met my father a year later, she saw something valuable, a man with business ambitions who projected confidence and stability. a man who could give her the legitimacy she lacked, a man who might be willing to accept her existing child as part of a package deal. And my father had agreed not out of love for Rebecca or affection for my mother, but as a transaction. I understood this instinctively because I understood my father. He calculated everything in terms of advantage and disadvantage, cost and benefit. A ready-made family would make him appear stable and responsible to business partners. A wife with a young daughter signaled commitment and reliability. Rebecca wasn't a child he loved, but an asset he acquired, part of the arrangement that brought my mother into his life. This explained everything I had never understood about my childhood. Mother's relentless focus on Rebecca's success wasn't ordinary parental pride, it was desperation. Rebecca was Mother's only biological child, the only person in that house who truly belonged to her. If Rebecca failed, the entire justification for their family arrangement would collapse. Mother had traded her independence for security, had bound herself to a man she might not have loved, all to give Rebecca opportunities she couldn't have provided alone. Rebecca had to succeed because Rebecca's success validated every sacrifice Mother had made. I was never part of that original deal. I arrived 3 years after the marriage in addition to an arrangement that was already complete. Father had agreed to adopt Rebecca, but he had never agreed to genuinely love any child. When I was born, I represented nothing to him except another responsibility, another cost, another presence in a house where the important roles had already been assigned. Mother already had the child she cared about. Father already had the family image he needed. I was surplus unnecessary and therefore unvalued. The favoritism I had experienced my entire life suddenly made perfect sense. Every time Mother praised Rebecca and ignored me, she was protecting the child who represented her past, her sacrifices, her desperate gamble for a better life. Every time Father dismissed my achievements, he was expressing his fundamental indifference to a child who brought him no advantage. Rebecca was the symbol of their partnership. I was just the accident that came after. I wondered if Rebecca knew. Had Mother told her the truth about her biological father? Did Rebecca understand why she had been pushed so relentlessly? Why failure was treated as catastrophic? Why everything depended on her? Or had she grown up as ignorant as I was, accepting the family dynamics as normal without understanding the hidden architecture that created them? Part of me felt a strange pity for my sister. She had been burdened with expectations. I had been spared, forced to carry the weight of Mother's entire self-justification on her shoulders. Her cruelty toward me might have been her own response to impossible pressure, though that didn't excuse it, it perhaps explained it. Father had known the truth all along. He had used that knowledge as leverage, holding Mother's secret over her head for decades. Every time Mother deferred to him, every time she stayed silent during his pronouncements, she was protecting herself from exposure. Father could have revealed Rebecca's origins at any moment, could have humiliated Mother publicly, could have destroyed the careful image they had constructed together. He held that power and wielded it invisibly, keeping Mother compliant through the threat of revelation rather than explicit demands. The family I grew up in wasn't dysfunctional by accident. It was designed that way from the beginning, built on secrets and transactions and the careful management of hidden truths. I had spent 18 years believing I was simply unloved, that something about me was fundamentally unworthy of attention and care. Now I understood that the problem had never been me. The problem was a system constructed before I was born, a system that had no room for me, a system that treated my existence as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. But if Rebecca wasn't Father's daughter, Jasmine wondered whose daughter was she herself. The questions about my own origins haunted me for weeks, but I forced myself to set them aside. I had a business to run, and the business was growing faster than I had anticipated. What had started as simple inventory management software had evolved into something larger, a company with employees, investors, and ambitions that extended beyond my original modest goals. Robert had taught me to think bigger, to see opportunities where others saw only problems. One of those opportunities was distressed debt. The concept was straightforward. When companies failed, their debts were often sold to investors willing to take risks on recovery. A startup that collapsed owing $500,000 might have its debt purchased for $50,000 by someone betting that the company or its assets could eventually be worth more than that purchase price. If the company recovered, the investor made substantial returns. If it didn't, the loss was limited to the initial purchase. My company had created a small venture fund specifically for these opportunities, evaluating dozens of potential acquisitions each quarter based on strict financial criteria. The evaluation process was deliberately impersonal. My team analyzed debt amounts, recovery probabilities, asset values, and market conditions. We made decisions based on spreadsheets and projections, not stories or sympathies. This wasn't heartlessness, it was discipline. Getting emotionally involved with every struggling company would have clouded our judgment and ultimately hurt both us and the founders we were trying to help. The numbers had to make sense, or we walked away. One file that crossed my desk during a routine review session was for a company called D-Tech. According to the documentation, it had been a promising technology startup that collapsed after one of its partners embezzled a significant portion of their operating funds. The embezzler had fled the country, leaving the remaining founder drowning in debts he couldn't pay. The company's assets included some valuable intellectual property and equipment that could be liquidated or leveraged. The debt amount was substantial, but not unreasonable. The recovery probability, assuming competent management of the remaining assets, was favorable. I approved the purchase based entirely on those numbers. I didn't read the founder's name. I didn't research his background or his story. D-Tech was one of 8 acquisitions we made that quarter, a single-line item in a portfolio of calculated risks. My signature on the approval form was routine, mechanical, utterly devoid of personal significance. I had no idea that this particular transaction would eventually reshape my entire life. The founder of D-Tech was a man named Daniel. When his company collapsed, he had been weeks away from losing everything, not just the business, but his house, his savings, his entire financial existence. The partner who had stolen from him had been a childhood friend, someone Daniel had trusted completely. The betrayal had been devastating, and the financial consequences had been catastrophic. Creditors were circling. Foreclosure notices had arrived. Daniel was preparing to declare personal bankruptcy when something unexpected happened. A company he had never heard of purchased his debt. The purchase gave Daniel breathing room he desperately needed. The new debt holder, my company, operating through a subsidiary with a name that didn't connect to me publicly, offered him restructured payment terms that were aggressive but survivable. Daniel used that time to find new investors to salvage what remained of his intellectual property and to slowly rebuild what his former partner had destroyed. It took him 2 years, but he eventually emerged from the wreckage with a functioning company and a future that had seemed impossible when he was staring at those foreclosure notices. Daniel spent those 2 years trying to discover who had saved him. He wanted to express gratitude, to understand why a faceless investment company had taken a chance on his failing startup when everyone else had written him off. But the subsidiary name led nowhere useful, and the people he contacted couldn't or wouldn't reveal the parent company's identity. Eventually, he stopped searching and simply accepted his good fortune as one of those mysteries that would never be solved. He had no idea that his benefactor was a 26-year-old woman who had never heard his name, who had approved his debt purchase without a second thought, who remained completely unaware that he existed. 2 years after that transaction, an envelope arrived at my apartment. The return address was my parents' house, a place I hadn't visited or contacted in nearly a decade. Inside was a formal invitation printed on heavy cream paper with gold lettering. Rebecca was getting married. The engagement party would be held at a rented ballroom downtown. Family and friends were invited to celebrate this joyous occasion. I read the invitation several times, trying to understand why they had sent it. My family had made no effort to contact me in years. They hadn't reached out when my business succeeded, hadn't acknowledged my existence in any public forum, hadn't shown the slightest interest in what I had become. Why invite me now? Perhaps they assumed I wouldn't come and wanted the moral high ground of having extended an invitation. Perhaps Rebecca wanted witnesses to her triumph, including the sister she had always outshone. Perhaps it was simply social obligation, the kind of gesture families make regardless of actual feeling. The fiancé's name was listed on the invitation, Daniel. The name meant nothing to me. I had never met anyone named Daniel connected to my family's social circle. I certainly didn't connect him to a debt file I had approved 2 years earlier without reading the founder's details. To me, he was simply Rebecca's latest success, a successful entrepreneur according to the invitation, someone impressive enough to justify a ballroom celebration. I considered throwing the invitation away. Attending would mean seeing my parents for the first time since I had walked out at 18. It would mean watching Rebecca bask in attention and approval while I sat at a back table invisible as always. It would mean subjecting myself to a family dynamic I had spent years escaping. Every rational instinct told me to decline, but refusing would confirm what my family had always believed about me, that I was jealous, petty, incapable of celebrating anyone else's happiness. They would tell guests that I hadn't come because I couldn't handle seeing Rebecca succeed. They would use my absence as proof that I was exactly the bitter failure they had always claimed. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I marked my calendar and bought a simple black dress for the occasion. I would attend, I would be polite, and I would leave early. I expected nothing except an uncomfortable evening and perhaps some closure. Jasmine would walk into that engagement party, not knowing she had already changed Daniel's life forever. The ballroom glittered with the kind of excessive elegance that my family had always valued above substance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting prismatic light across 200 guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Waiters in black vests circulated with champagne flutes and elegant appetizers. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Everything about the event announced wealth, success, and social arrival. This was not merely an engagement party. It was a performance designed to impress everyone who mattered in my parents' carefully cultivated world. I arrived deliberately late, hoping to slip in unnoticed and find a seat where I could observe without participating. My dress was simple black silk purchased on sale 3 months earlier for occasions exactly like this one events where I needed to appear presentable without drawing attention. Compared to the designer gowns and borrowed diamonds surrounding me, I looked modest, almost plain. That was intentional. I had not come to compete with Rebecca. I had come to prove that I could attend without drama, without jealousy, without confirming their expectations of who I was. Mother spotted me the moment I entered. Her smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of displeasure, quickly masked by social training. She did not come to greet me. Neither did Father, who was working the room with the aggressive charm I remembered from childhood, telling everyone within earshot about his successful daughter and her brilliant fiancé. Rebecca stood near the center of the ballroom in a gown that probably cost more than my first year of rent after leaving home. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears borrowed from Mother's collection for the occasion. She looked beautiful and triumphant and completely in her element. No one rushed to welcome me. A few distant relatives glanced my way with expressions of mild confusion, as if trying to place where they had seen me before. I found an empty seat at a table near the back of the room, far from the head table where my family held court close to an exit I could use for an early departure. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and settled in to watch the evening unfold from a safe distance. The party proceeded through its expected rhythms. Toasts were offered, speeches were made, guests mingled and networked and performed the social rituals that defined these gatherings. I observed it all with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar tribe. These were the people my parents had always valued more than me, business associates, whose approval mattered, society friends, whose opinions carried weight, relatives who appeared only when appearances demanded. I had never been part of this world. Sitting alone at my back table, I felt that exclusion more clearly than ever. Midway through the evening, Daniel took the microphone. He was handsome in the conventional way that successful men often are, well-groomed, confident, wearing a tailored suit that fit perfectly. His smile was charming, his voice warm, as he thanked guests for coming to celebrate his engagement to the most wonderful woman I've ever met. The crowd responded with appreciative murmurs and raised glasses. Then Daniel's tone shifted. He said, to share something personal. His journey to this moment had not been easy. 5 years ago, his company had nearly been destroyed when a trusted partner embezzled their operating funds. He had faced bankruptcy, foreclosure, the loss of everything he had built. But someone had saved him an investment company that had purchased his debt and given him time to rebuild. He had never been able to discover who was behind that company, but he wanted to acknowledge them publicly. He wanted to thank the mysterious benefactor who had believed in him when no one else would. Daniel gestured toward the presentation screen where a logo appeared, the subsidiary name my company used for debt acquisitions. I recognized it immediately, though I had never expected to see it in this context. My champagne glass froze halfway to my lips. The reaction in the ballroom was immediate and unmistakable. Several guests from the business community straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting from polite attention to sharp recognition. That logo had been appearing in industry publications for the past 2 years, associated with a rapidly growing tech company that was making waves in the small business software market, a company that had been profiled recently in a major business magazine. A company founded and owned by a young woman whose name was slowly spreading through the business world. A company founded and owned by me. Whispers began spreading through the ballroom like fire through dry grass. I could see guests leaning toward each other, murmuring questions and confirmations. Someone pulled out a phone to verify what they suspected. Daniel noticed the reaction and looked confused, unsure why his heartfelt thank you was generating such unexpected buzz. He glanced at Rebecca, who was staring at the screen with an expression I couldn't read. Then Rebecca's gaze moved from the screen to the back of the room, to the table where I sat alone, to me. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. 200 people stopped their conversations and turned to look in my direction, following Rebecca's stare. Father's face had gone pale. Mother gripped her champagne glass so tightly I thought the stem might snap. Daniel looked between his fiancé and the woman at the back table, still not understanding what everyone else had just realized. I didn't move from my seat. I hadn't planned any of this. I hadn't known Daniel was connected to D-Tech until the logo appeared on that screen. I hadn't known that the debt file I had approved 2 years ago, without reading the founder's name, belonged to the man my sister was about to marry. The coincidence was so improbable, so perfectly ironic, that it felt almost designed, though I knew it was nothing but chance. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what everyone in that ballroom understood in this moment of frozen silence. The daughter who had been dismissed as a failure, who had been invisible at family gatherings, who had left at 18 with nothing and been forgotten, that daughter had built something real. And without knowing it, without intending it, she had saved the man her sister loved. The sister they had dismissed had been quietly building an empire and had unknowingly saved the man Rebecca was about to marry. The silence in the ballroom lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Daniel abandoned the microphone, leaving it to screech with feedback as he pushed through the crowd toward my table. Guests parted for him automatically, their eyes following his progress across the room. I watched him approach with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing the scene from somewhere outside my own body. This couldn't really be happening. This impossible coincidence couldn't actually be unfolding at my sister's engagement party. Daniel's hands were shaking when he reached me. Up close, I could see the color had drained from his face, leaving him pale beneath the ballroom's warm lighting. He stopped a few feet from my table, struggling to form words that kept catching in his throat. "Is that your company?" he finally managed. Were you the one who—" He couldn't finish the question, but he didn't need to. We both knew what he was asking. I stood slowly, acutely aware that every eye in the room was fixed on us. 200 guests had stopped their conversations, abandoned their champagne, forgotten whatever they had been doing moments before. They were watching this exchange with the hungry attention people reserve for unexpected drama at social events. I could feel my parents' stares from across the room, Father's shocked, mother's calculating, both of them trying to understand how their forgotten daughter had suddenly become the center of attention. "I approved that transaction 2 years ago," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. There was no point in being anything other than honest. It was one file among dozens that crossed my desk that quarter. I never looked at your name. I evaluated the numbers, determined the risk was acceptable, and signed the paperwork. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know anything about you until 5 minutes ago when you put that logo on the screen. Daniel's face cycled through emotions faster than I could track them. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which shifted into something that looked almost like fear. The man who had built his recovery around gratitude toward an unknown benefactor was now confronting the reality that his savior had been utterly indifferent to his existence. I hadn't believed in him. I hadn't seen his potential. I had simply analyzed a spreadsheet and decided the numbers justified the risk. There was nothing personal or heroic about what I had done. Robert stepped forward from where he had been standing near the back wall. I had asked him to accompany me tonight partly for moral support, and partly because he was curious to observe my family dynamics firsthand. Now his presence served an unexpected purpose. "I can verify the paperwork," he said, addressing both Daniel and the surrounding guests who were straining to hear every word. Jasmine's fund purchased the distressed debt through standard investment channels. There was no personal connection between her and D-Tech's founder. No prior knowledge of his identity. She learned about who he was tonight at the same moment everyone else did. The confirmation should have diffused the tension. It established that I hadn't orchestrated some elaborate scheme to embarrass my sister or impress her fiancé. But somehow, Robert's verification made the situation more uncomfortable rather than less. If I had saved Daniel deliberately, it might have seemed like manipulation, but at least it would have been comprehensible. The fact that I had done it accidentally without even knowing his name transformed the coincidence into something that felt almost supernatural. I had changed this man's life completely by accident, as a side effect of building something larger, without any awareness that he existed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I heard fragments of whispered conversations. "Can you believe it? And she had no idea, and what are the odds?" as guests processed what they were witnessing. The narrative of the evening had shifted dramatically. This was no longer simply Rebecca's engagement party. This was the night everyone discovered that the family's invisible daughter had somehow become more successful than anyone had imagined and had unknowingly rescued the man her sister was about to marry. Then Rebecca moved. She crossed the ballroom with her designer gown sweeping behind her, her heels clicking against the polished floor with each deliberate step. The crowd parted for her, as they had for Daniel, creating a clear path between my sister and me. She stopped directly in front of my table, close enough that I could see the fury burning in her eyes, the tremor in her jaw as she fought to maintain composure. We faced each other for the first time in years. The last time we had been this close, I had been a teenager leaving home with a suitcase and a bus ticket. Now we were adults, standing in a ballroom full of witnesses with a decade of silence and resentment suspended between us. I could see Rebecca struggling to process what had just happened, trying to reconcile the sister she had always dismissed with the reality that had just been revealed. "You planned this," Rebecca said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You came here to humiliate me. You've been waiting for years to find some way to ruin my moment, and this is what you came up with." I shook my head slowly. "I came here because you invited me. I didn't know Daniel was connected to my company until he put that logo on the screen. I didn't know any of this would happen." "I don't believe you," Rebecca hissed. "You always had to make everything about yourself, even tonight, even my engagement party. You couldn't just let me have this one thing." I felt a strange calm settle over me. The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from reality that it didn't even hurt. "I didn't create these facts, Rebecca. The transaction happened 2 years ago, long before you met Daniel. The company logo was already his benefactor before he ever knew your name. Everything that just happened was already true before I walked in the door tonight. I didn't plan anything. I just exist." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response that wouldn't come. Around us, the ballroom remained frozen, 200 guests holding their breath as they watched two sisters confront each other across years of accumulated silence. But Daniel wasn't looking at Rebecca anymore. He was looking at Jasmine with something new in his eyes. The confrontation with Rebecca ended without resolution. She stared at me for a long moment, her rage battling with something that might have been confusion or fear, then turned and walked back toward Daniel without another word. But the damage had been done. The carefully orchestrated engagement party had transformed into something else entirely, a spectacle that would be discussed and dissected for months in the social circles my parents valued so highly. The ballroom collapsed into chaos around us. Guests clustered in small groups, whispering furiously and checking their phones, probably searching for information about my company, verifying the connections they had just witnessed. The string quartet had stopped playing, unsure whether to continue providing background music for a celebration that no longer felt celebratory. Waiters stood frozen with their trays, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. The event had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Father attempted to salvage the situation. He moved to the center of the room and clapped his hands loudly, trying to recapture attention. "Family matters should remain private," he declared in the commanding voice I remembered from childhood. "Let's not allow a minor misunderstanding to ruin this wonderful evening. Please, everyone, enjoy the refreshments." But no one was listening to him. For once, his authority meant nothing. The guests were far more interested in the drama unfolding before them than in following his directions. Rebecca stood frozen near the head table, her designer gown suddenly looking like a costume rather than an achievement. Her hand kept moving to the engagement ring on her finger, touching it unconsciously, as if reassuring herself it was still there. I watched her face cycle through expressions, anger, humiliation, fear, as she struggled to process what had just happened to her perfect evening. Part of me felt something close to sympathy. Whatever our history, she hadn't asked for this public exposure any more than I had. Then I noticed Daniel. While everyone else was focused on the whispered conversations and social maneuvering, he was moving quietly toward the exit. He had excused himself from Rebecca's side with a murmured comment about needing air, and now he was walking quickly across the ballroom with the focused determination of someone escaping a situation that had become inconvenient. Rebecca didn't even notice him leaving. She was too busy fielding questions from relatives who had suddenly remembered she had a sister. I gathered my purse and headed for the same exit. I wasn't following Daniel, I simply wanted to leave to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom and return to my quiet apartment where I could process everything that had happened. The exit happened to be in the direction Daniel had gone. That was coincidence, nothing more. The parking lot was cool and quiet after the ballroom's oppressive heat. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the rows of expensive cars belonging to the evening's guests. I walked toward where I had parked, breathing deeply, feeling the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. The night was over. I had survived. I could go home and never think about this again. "Wait, please." Daniel's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him approaching quickly, his earlier composure completely abandoned. Under the fluorescent lights, his handsome face looked different, sharper, more calculating, stripped of the warm charm he had displayed inside. He reached me in a few quick strides and grabbed my arm before I could react. "I need to talk to you," he said, slightly breathless. "I made a mistake. I didn't know I should have—" He stumbled over his words, struggling to find language that would accomplish what he wanted without revealing too clearly what that was. But his grip on my arm told me everything his words were trying to hide. "Let go of me," I said quietly. He released my arm but didn't step back. "You have to understand. When I met Rebecca, I didn't know about you. I didn't know you existed, that you had built all this, that you were the one who saved my company. If you had known what?" I asked. "If you had known I was successful, you would have pursued me instead of her." Daniel's face confirmed what his words were trying to deny. I'm not saying—" He took a breath and tried again, reaching for my hand. "You're the one I should have been with. You're the real success story here. Rebecca is wonderful, but she's not. She doesn't have what you have. Give me a chance to make this right. Give me a chance to know you properly." I pulled my hand away and stepped back, creating distance between us. The audacity of what he was proposing was breathtaking in its shamelessness. He was standing in this parking lot of his own engagement party, trying to trade up from one sister to another because he had just discovered which one held more value. His loyalty to Rebecca had lasted exactly as long as she had seemed like the best available option. "Let me be clear about something, Daniel." My voice was steady and cold, colder than I had known I could be. "You're not leaving Rebecca. You're not choosing me. You're not making some romantic gesture based on newfound feelings. You're just selecting whoever looks like the winner right now." His face flushed. "That's not fair. I'm trying to tell you that I feel a connection." "You feel a connection to my company's valuation," I interrupted. "You feel a connection to the success you just discovered I have. 5 minutes ago, I was the invisible sister at the back table, and you didn't even glance in my direction. Now suddenly, you feel a connection." I shook my head. "I am not a prize to be won. I am not an upgrade from my sister, and I am certainly not interested in a man whose loyalty lasts exactly as long as his convenience." I turned and walked to my car without looking back. My heels clicked against the asphalt, with each step the only sound in the quiet parking lot. I didn't run. I didn't hurry. I simply walked away from a man who had just revealed exactly who he was. As I reached my car and unlocked the door, I glanced back toward the ballroom one last time. Through the large windows, I could see the party continuing in its fractured state, and I could see Rebecca standing near the glass staring out at the parking lot. She had watched the entire exchange. Even from this distance, I could see that she had heard every word. Rebecca had heard every word, and now she knew exactly what kind of man she had agreed to marry. The week following the engagement party passed in a strange blur. I went through the motions of running my company, attending meetings, reviewing reports, making decisions, but my mind kept returning to that ballroom, to Rebecca's face in the window, to Daniel's desperate attempt to switch allegiances. I had not heard from my family since that night, and I expected to never hear from them again. The revelation of my success, combined with Daniel's public betrayal of Rebecca, had probably cemented my status as the enemy who had destroyed their carefully constructed world. So when my assistant announced that my mother was in the lobby asking to see me, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite fear, not quite anger, but something cold and watchful that had learned to prepare for the worst. I could have refused to see her. I could have sent word that I was too busy, that she should make an appointment, that whatever she wanted to say could be communicated through lawyers or not at all. But curiosity won over caution. I told my assistant to send her in. The woman who walked into my office looked older than I remembered. It had only been a week since the engagement party, but the stress appeared to have aged her by years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her clothing, usually immaculate, seemed hastily assembled. She moved with the careful steps of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. When she sat down in the chair across from my desk, she did so without waiting for an invitation, as if she knew she wouldn't receive one and had decided to dispense with courtesy. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "Before you hear it from someone else, before your father uses it against all of us." I remained silent, keeping my expression neutral. After everything I had discovered about my mother, her role in the Eastbrook fraud, her manipulation of family dynamics, her calculated silence throughout my childhood, I was not inclined to offer comfort or encouragement. If she had something to confess, she would have to do it without my help. Mother's hands twisted in her lap, fingers intertwining and separating in a nervous rhythm. "I know you've been investigating our family," she said. "I know you found the bankruptcy records from Eastbrook. I know you discovered that Rebecca is my daughter from before I married your father." She paused, her eyes fixed on her restless hands. "What you don't know is the rest of it." I waited. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of accumulated pain and distance. Whatever she was about to say, I could tell it was costing her tremendous effort. Part of me wanted to spare her the struggle. A larger part remembered every birthday she had forgotten, every achievement she had ignored, every time she had chosen Rebecca over me, without explanation or apology. "You're not his biological daughter either," Mother finally said. The words came out barely above a whisper, as if speaking them quietly might somehow lessen their impact. "When I married him, I was already pregnant. With you." The statement hung in the air between us.
I heard the words, clearly understood their meaning intellectually, but my brain refused to fully process them. The man I had called father for 18 years, the man whose disapproval had shaped my entire childhood, the man whose coldness had driven me from my home, he wasn't my father at all. He didn't know at first, Mother continued, still unable to meet my eyes. I thought I could keep it secret forever. You were born 7 months after the wedding. I told him you were premature. He believed me, or at least he pretended to believe me. For 3 years, everything seemed fine. He wasn't warm toward you, but I thought that was just his personality. I thought he would grow to love you eventually. What changed? I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant. He ordered a DNA test. Mother's face crumpled with the memory. When you were 3 years old, he took samples secretly and sent them to a laboratory. When the results came back, he didn't confront me immediately. He waited. He gathered evidence. He built a case. She finally looked up at me, her eyes wet with tears I wasn't sure she had earned the right to cry. When he finally showed me the results, I thought he would divorce me. I thought he would expose me publicly, destroy my reputation, take everything. I was prepared for that. But he didn't leave, I said. No. Mother shook her head slowly. Leaving would have meant splitting assets. It would have meant admitting publicly that he had been fooled, that he had raised another man's child for 3 years without knowing. His pride couldn't accept that humiliation. So instead he stayed. He kept the secret, and he used it as leverage over me for the next 25 years. The pieces of my childhood were rearranging themselves in my mind, forming a new picture that was somehow both clearer and more devastating than the old one. Every criticism Father had directed at me, every dismissal, every time he had chosen Rebecca while ignoring my existence, none of it had been about my behavior or my achievements. I had never had a chance to earn his approval because his contempt had been decided before I could walk. He punished you, Mother said, her voice breaking. Not directly, he was too careful for that, but constantly, every day in small ways. Every time he praised Rebecca and ignored you. Every time he refused to acknowledge your accomplishments. He was punishing me for deceiving him, and you were the instrument of that punishment. The evidence of my betrayal, living in his house, eating at his table, calling him father. Why didn't you protect me? The question escaped before I could stop it, carrying more pain than I had intended to reveal. Mother's tears fell freely now. I couldn't. Every time I tried to stand up for you, he reminded me what he could do. He could expose everything. He could prove I had committed fraud both in our marriage and at Eastbrook. He could take Rebecca away from me. I was trapped, Jasmine. I've been trapped for 25 years, and I sacrificed you to survive. I sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what she had revealed. My entire childhood had been shaped by a secret I never knew existed. I had spent 18 years believing I was somehow inadequate, somehow unworthy of love, when the truth was far simpler and far more cruel. I had been punished for the crime of existing. Jasmine finally understood. She had never been part of this family at all. She was just the ghost of her mother's secret walking through a house full of people who wished she didn't exist. After my mother left my office, I went home and didn't come out for 3 days. I turned off my phone, ignored the emails accumulating in my inbox, and told my assistant to handle everything that didn't require my personal signature. The company could survive without me for a few days. I wasn't sure I could survive without time to process what I had just learned. My apartment became a cocoon of silence while I sat with the weight of my mother's confession. The man I had spent 18 years trying to please, whose approval I had desperately sought, whose criticism had shaped my understanding of my own worth, he had never been my father. His coldness hadn't been a personality flaw I might have eventually overcome. It had been deliberate punishment for a crime I didn't commit, inflicted on a child who had no idea why she was being rejected. Every memory of my childhood now carried a different meaning, a darker subtext that explained everything while excusing nothing. I thought about what I could do with everything I now knew. The power I held was unprecedented.
I had the fraud evidence from the Eastbrook bankruptcy public documents that proved my mother had orchestrated financial crimes, while my father had served as the willing frontman. I had the adoption records showing Rebecca's true origins. I had my mother's confession about my own biological father, and I had the implicit threat of the DNA revelation that could shatter whatever remained of my parents' marriage. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. I could release everything simultaneously, send the documents to newspapers, post the revelations on social media, hire a lawyer to pursue criminal charges for the fraud. I could watch my family tear itself apart as each secret surfaced, as trust dissolved, as the carefully constructed facade collapsed into rubble. They had spent my entire childhood making me feel powerless. Now I could show them what real powerlessness felt like. The temptation was overwhelming. In my darkest moments during those 3 days, I fantasized about destruction on a scale that matched the pain they had caused me. I imagined my father's face when he realized his reputation was ruined. I imagined my mother's terror as her secrets became public. I imagined Rebecca's shock when she learned the truth about her own origins. The revenge would be complete, total, devastating. But on the 4th day, something shifted inside me. I woke up before dawn and sat by my window watching the city slowly brighten as the sun rose. I thought about who I had become since leaving home, at 18 the person I had built through years of struggle and determination. I had created a successful company through honest work and ethical practices. I had earned Robert's respect by taking responsibility for my failures rather than blaming others. I had built a life that I could be proud of, a life that proved I was more than what my family had believed me to be. If I destroyed them the way they had tried to destroy me, what would that make me? If I used secrets as weapons, if I caused pain simply because I could, if I became the kind of person who wielded power for cruelty rather than justice, then they would have won. They would have turned me into a reflection of themselves. The revenge would feel satisfying for a moment, but it would poison everything I had built. I made my decision carefully, drawing lines between justice and cruelty. The fraud was different from the family secrets. The Eastbrook documents were public record available to anyone who knew where to look. The crimes they documented had hurt real people, investors who lost money, employees who lost jobs, business partners who were deceived. My father was still working in the same industry, still seeking senior positions, still benefiting from a reputation built on lies. If I stayed silent, I was complicit in his continued deception of employers who deserved to know who they were hiring. But the DNA results, the adoption records, the tangled web of secrets about biological parentage, those were different. Revealing them would cause pain, but it wouldn't serve justice. Rebecca didn't deserve to have her identity shattered as punishment for my parents' choices. My mother's confession about my biological father was information that affected only me. Using these secrets as weapons would make me exactly the kind of person I had spent years refusing to become. I would expose the fraud because it was right. I would keep the family secrets because exposing them would only be cruel. On the 5th day, I returned to work and drafted a simple email. The recipient was the HR department of the company where my father was being considered for a senior position. A company I happened to know through my business network was in final negotiations with him. The email was brief and factual. I attached the publicly available bankruptcy documents from the Eastbrook case, highlighting the pages that showed my father's involvement in the fraud. I wrote only one sentence of explanation. I believe you should be aware of this candidate's financial history before finalizing any employment decisions. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, and anyone who wanted to verify their authenticity could access them through the same public records I had used. I wasn't hiding. I was simply letting the truth do the work without making myself the story. 3 days later, my father received a rejection letter from that company. The position he had been confident of securing had evaporated without explanation. Within a week, other companies he had approached began declining interviews as well. Word was spreading through the industry the way it always does, quietly through back channels, through HR departments, sharing notes about problematic candidates. No one announced what they had learned. No one publicly accused him of anything. The information simply circulated among people who needed to know, and doors began closing one by one. I watched this happen from a distance, feeling neither triumph nor guilt. I had not lied. I had not exaggerated. I had not done anything except ensure that people making hiring decisions had access to relevant public information. If my father's career was collapsing, it was because of choices he had made 15 years ago, not because of anything I had invented or manipulated. Jasmine didn't need to announce her revenge, she just needed to let the truth do its work. The industry my father had spent his career in was smaller than outsiders realized. Beneath the surface of corporate formality, it operated like a village. Everyone knew, everyone's reputations traveled through informal networks, and a single piece of damaging information could spread through back channels faster than any official announcement. I had understood this when I sent those documents to the first HR department. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the collapse would accelerate once it began. Within 2 weeks of my email, the quiet whispers had become a roar that my father couldn't escape. The company that had been about to hire him didn't just decline, they shared their concerns with colleagues at other firms who were also considering him. Those colleagues checked the public bankruptcy records themselves and found exactly what they had been warned about. Phone calls were made, notes were compared. Within a month, my father's name had become synonymous with risk in every hiring conversation that mattered. I learned about his deteriorating situation through Robert's network rather than through any direct contact. Executives who had once returned my father's calls immediately now let his messages go to voicemail. Interviews that had been scheduled were quietly canceled with vague excuses about changing organizational needs. Companies that had actively recruited him suddenly discovered they were moving in a different direction. The transformation was swift and merciless. My father went from experienced executive exploring new opportunities to untouchable liability in less than 30 days. The speed of his fall surprised even me. I had expected the truth to cause problems for him, but I had assumed his decades of experience and established relationships would provide some protection. What I had underestimated was how thin that protection actually was. His reputation had always been built on appearance rather than substance, on the careful management of how others perceived him rather than on genuine achievement. Once the foundation of that perception cracked, there was nothing solid underneath to support him. Desperate to stop the bleeding, my father made a decision that would prove to be catastrophically foolish. He hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against me, claiming defamation and intentional interference with his business relationships. The lawsuit demanded substantial financial damages and sought an injunction preventing me from sharing any information about his past with anyone in the industry. He was trying to use the legal system to force me into silence, to make the truth too expensive for me to tell. But he didn't stop there. He also launched a public relations campaign appearing on local news programs to tell his version of the story. In these interviews, he portrayed himself as the victim of a vindictive daughter, conducting a personal vendetta against her own family. He spoke emotionally about the pain of being betrayed by someone he had raised, about the unfairness of having ancient history weaponized against him, about his hope that cooler heads would prevail, and that his daughter would see reason before more damage was done. He never mentioned the fraud. He never explained what the documents actually showed. He simply positioned himself as a sympathetic figure caught in a family drama that had spiraled out of control. The lawsuit arrived at my office via certified mail, thick with legal language and threatening rhetoric. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had handled my company's contracts from the beginning, reviewed it with barely concealed amusement. "He's suing you for sharing public records," she said, shaking her head. "This case has no merit whatsoever. The only question is whether he knows that and is hoping you'll settle to avoid the hassle, or whether he's genuinely delusional enough to think he can win." I told Patricia to fight it. I would not settle. I would not be intimidated into silence. If my father wanted a legal battle, I would give him one and I would win. The case went before a judge 6 weeks after it was filed. I sat in the courtroom beside Patricia, watching my father enter with his own legal team. He looked diminished, somehow smaller than I remembered, though his suit was expensive and his posture remained rigid with practiced dignity. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed forward, as if acknowledging my presence would be beneath him. The hearing lasted exactly 15 minutes. Patricia presented our defense with surgical precision. Every document I had shared was already part of the public record released during the Eastbrook bankruptcy proceedings and accessible to anyone who requested them. I had not created false information. I had not embellished or distorted the facts. I had simply ensured that people making important decisions had access to accurate information that was already legally available. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. You cannot defame someone by stating facts. You cannot wrongfully interfere with business relationships by sharing accurate public records. My father's lawyer attempted to argue that my intent had been malicious, that I had deliberately weaponized the information to harm his client. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. Intent was irrelevant when the information was true and publicly available. If my father's reputation had been damaged, it was damaged by his own past actions, not by my decision to share records that anyone could have found. The case was dismissed. The judge ordered my father to pay my legal fees as penalty for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Patricia gathered her papers with quiet satisfaction. Across the courtroom, my father sat motionless, absorbing the finality of what had just happened. When he finally stood to leave, I saw his face clearly for the first time since the hearing began. The rigid dignity had crumbled. His skin looked gray, his shoulders slumped, his movements slow and uncertain. He walked out of the courthouse looking 20 years older than he had looked walking in. His lawyer followed behind, already composing explanations that would make the defeat sound less total than it was. I remained seated for a few minutes after they left, processing what I felt. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in watching his humiliation. There was only a strange, hollow clarity, the recognition that this man who had controlled my childhood, whose approval I had desperately sought, whose rejection had driven me from my home, was ultimately powerless against the truth of his own choices. But Father's legal defeat was just the beginning. Rebecca was about to make things much worse for everyone. My father's courtroom humiliation should have been the end of the public drama. The lawsuit had failed spectacularly. The legal fees he now owed me added insult to injury, and anyone following the situation could see that his claims of victimhood had been thoroughly debunked. I assumed the family would retreat into private shame, licking their wounds away from public view. I underestimated Rebecca's capacity for desperate measures. 3 days after the lawsuit was dismissed, Rebecca launched her counterattack on social media. She had always been skilled at cultivating her online presence, carefully curated photos of her life, strategic friendships with minor influencers, a following built on the appearance of effortless success. Now she weaponized that platform against me with a post that spread through her networks like wildfire. The message was long, emotional, and devastatingly effective. She painted a picture of a family torn apart by a jealous sister who couldn't accept that others had found happiness. According to Rebecca's narrative, I had always been difficult and resentful, a problem child who had abandoned her family at 18 rather than work through normal family conflicts. She claimed I had spent years nursing grudges, building wealth specifically to use as a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy the people who had raised me. The engagement party revelation wasn't coincidence. It was a calculated ambush designed to humiliate her on her special night. The lawsuit against our father wasn't justice. It was persecution of an innocent man by a daughter consumed with bitterness. "My sister is using her money to hurt people who loved her," Rebecca wrote. "She couldn't stand seeing me happy, seeing our parents proud, seeing our family whole, so she found ways to tear us apart. This is what jealousy looks like when it has resources." The post went viral within Rebecca's circles. Her influencer friends shared it with sympathetic commentary. Thousands of comments poured in from people who had never met any of us, expressing outrage at my cruelty and offering Rebecca their support. For 48 hours, the narrative belonged entirely to her. I was the villain, the cold, calculating sister who had weaponized success against her own family. My company's social media accounts received angry messages from strangers demanding I apologize. A few business contacts reached out awkwardly, asking if everything was okay, clearly wondering whether they should distance themselves from someone so publicly accused of family destruction. I watched the storm build without responding immediately. My instinct was to stay silent, to let the noise fade, as internet outrage always does, to trust that the truth would eventually surface without my intervention. But Patricia called me on the second day with a warning. The narrative was starting to affect my business relationships. 2 potential clients had postponed meetings. A journalist was asking questions about the family feud behind my company. Silence was being interpreted as guilt. So I responded. Not with emotion, not with counter-accusations, not with the kind of dramatic rebuttal that would fuel more conflict. I simply told the truth, documented and verifiable. My post was shorter than Rebecca's, but far more substantial. I shared a timeline of events, starting with my departure from home at 18 with $187. I described the years of working multiple jobs, the failed first business, the slow construction of something real through determination and honest effort. I explained that my investment in Daniel's company had been a routine business transaction, one file among dozens approved without any knowledge of who the founder was or any connection to my sister. I noted that I had learned Daniel's identity at the same moment everyone else did when he displayed my company's logo at his own engagement party. Then I addressed the fraud. I attached the publicly available bankruptcy documents from the Eastbrook case, the same documents that had been presented in court and that anyone could access through official channels. I explained that these records showed financial crimes committed 15 years ago, crimes that had hurt real people, crimes that my father had benefited from while escaping accountability. I had not invented this information. I had not distorted it. I had simply ensured that people making important decisions had access to facts that were already part of the public record. I didn't attack Rebecca personally. I didn't call her a liar or accuse her of manipulation. I simply presented the facts in chronological order with documentation for every claim and let readers draw their own conclusions. The internet responded as the internet always does when someone provides receipts. People checked my sources. They verified the timeline. They accessed the bankruptcy records themselves and found exactly what I had described. They compared Rebecca's emotional narrative to my documented facts and noticed that she had provided no evidence for any of her accusations, while I had provided evidence for all of mine. The tide turned with brutal speed. Within hours, the comments on Rebecca's post shifted from sympathy to skepticism to outright hostility. People who had supported her that morning were demanding explanations by evening. Her influencer friends quietly deleted their shares rather than be associated with a narrative that was crumbling publicly. Rebecca deleted her post by midnight, but the screenshots had already spread everywhere. Her follower count, which she had spent years building, began dropping hourly. The support that had seemed so overwhelming 48 hours earlier evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. She had gambled her public reputation on a story that couldn't withstand scrutiny, and she had lost. That night, after the chaos had settled into an uneasy quiet, I did something I hadn't planned. I picked up my phone and called Rebecca directly. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice hoarse from what sounded like hours of crying. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone hovering between hostility and exhaustion. "Haven't you done enough?" I didn't respond to the accusation. I didn't gloat about her failed attack or point out that she had brought this destruction on herself. Instead, I asked a question that had been sitting in my chest since the engagement party, waiting for the right moment to escape. "Do you remember when you fought Hannah because she was bullying me?" The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "What? You were 12. I was 9. Hannah had been tormenting me for months, and one day you found her cornering me behind the gymnasium. You shoved her so hard she fell down. You stood between us and dared her friends to try something." I paused, feeling the weight of the memory. "You were the only person who ever protected me. That was the last time I felt like I had a real sister." Rebecca's breathing became ragged through the phone. I could hear her struggling to compose herself, failing, giving up the attempt. When she finally spoke again, her voice broke on every word. "I don't know what happened to me," she whispered. "I don't know how I became this person." Mom was always in my ear telling me I had to be the best, that everything depended on me, that I couldn't let you catch up. I was just a kid. I believed her. And then years passed and I couldn't remember how to be anything else. I listened to her cry, not the performative tears she had displayed at the engagement party, but genuine sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. Part of me wanted to offer comfort, to tell her it wasn't too late, that we could still find our way back to being sisters. But I couldn't say those things because I didn't know if they were true. "I hope you figure it out," I said quietly. Then I hung up. For the first time in 20 years, Rebecca heard the sister she had lost and realized she might never get her back. The phone call with Rebecca left me unsettled in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had expected to feel vindicated, perhaps even triumphant, after her social media attack had backfired so spectacularly. Instead, I felt only a hollow sadness, the recognition that somewhere beneath the person she had become, there might still exist the 12-year-old girl who had once defended me against a bully. Whether that girl could ever resurface, I didn't know. Whether I wanted her to resurface, I wasn't sure. I returned to my work and tried to put the family drama behind me. The company needed my attention. We were expanding into new markets, negotiating significant contracts, building something that would outlast whatever temporary chaos my family was experiencing. I focused on what I could control and tried to release what I couldn't. 3 weeks after the engagement party, I learned that Daniel had formally ended his relationship with Rebecca. The news came through Robert, who had heard it from a business associate who traveled in the same social circles. The details were worse than I had imagined. Daniel hadn't broken up with Rebecca in person. He hadn't called her or arranged a private conversation to end their 2-year relationship with some semblance of dignity. Instead, he had sent a text message while she was at work, a few sentences typed on a phone screen, delivered without warning or explanation. While Rebecca sat in her office believing she still had a fiancé, Daniel had dispatched his assistant to their shared apartment to remove his belongings. When Rebecca came home that evening expecting to see the man she was supposed to marry, she found half the closet empty, half the bathroom cleared out, and a note on the kitchen counter. The note said only, "This situation has become too complicated. I need to focus on my business. I wish you well." No apology. No acknowledgement of the 2 years they had spent together. No recognition that she was a human being who deserved more than a dismissive farewell scribbled on a piece of paper. Just a cold calculation that Rebecca was no longer a useful asset, followed by a swift and efficient exit. By the time Rebecca processed what had happened, Daniel had already unfollowed her on every social media platform. His profile photos were updated within days, showing him at industry events and networking dinners, smiling broadly as if the engagement had never existed. He had erased her from his public narrative with the same efficiency he had used to remove his clothes from her closet. I heard through various channels that Rebecca had called Daniel repeatedly in the days following his departure. The voicemails she left progressed through predictable stages, confusion at first, then anger, then desperate pleas for him to at least explain what had happened. He never responded, not once. The man who had professed his love at the engagement party, who had thanked her publicly for standing by him during difficult times, simply vanished from her life as if she had never mattered. The final cruelty came when Rebecca learned through mutual friends who seemed almost eager to deliver the news that Daniel was already spending time with someone new. The woman was the daughter of a prominent venture capitalist, someone whose family connections could open doors that Rebecca's family never could, especially now that her father's reputation was destroyed and her own public image was in shambles. Daniel had assessed his options, identified a better opportunity, and moved on without hesitation. I thought about the night of the engagement party, when Daniel had chased me into the parking lot and tried to position himself as my romantic interest. He had been calculating then, too, recognizing that my success made me more valuable than Rebecca and attempting to switch allegiances before the full scope of the disaster became clear. When I rejected him, he had apparently decided to stay with Rebecca temporarily while searching for an even better option. Now he had found one. The venture capitalist's daughter represented everything Daniel actually valued: wealth connections, access to opportunities that could advance his career. Rebecca had been a stepping stone, and he had simply stepped off when something more promising appeared. I found myself feeling unexpected sympathy for my sister. Whatever her flaws, whatever pain she had caused me, she hadn't deserved to be discarded like obsolete inventory. Daniel's cruelty was calculated and complete, designed to minimize his own inconvenience while maximizing her humiliation. He had never loved her. He had invested in her, evaluating the potential returns, and eventually deciding to divest when the calculations no longer favored holding on. The calls to my office started 3 days after Daniel's departure. My receptionist informed me that a woman named Rebecca had called, asking to speak with me, and that she had been told I was unavailable. The next day, another call. The day after that, another. Each time my receptionist delivered the same message: Ms. Chen was not available and could not return the call. I didn't instruct my staff to block Rebecca specifically. I simply wasn't ready to talk to her. The conversation we had shared after her social media disaster had been difficult enough. I wasn't sure what another conversation would accomplish, whether it would lead to healing or simply reopen wounds that were finally beginning to close. Then the text message arrived. "I know I don't deserve it, but can we please talk just once?" I stared at those words for a long time. The message was different from anything Rebecca had ever sent me. There was no demand, no accusation, no assumption that she was entitled to my attention. Just a simple request, preceded by an acknowledgement that she had no right to make it. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to think about what I wanted from this situation, whether engaging with Rebecca would help either of us, or whether it would simply perpetuate a cycle of pain that we both needed to escape. She had hurt me for years. She had attacked me publicly just weeks ago. But she was also alone now, abandoned by the man she thought loved her, estranged from parents whose secrets were destroying them, facing the consequences of choices she had made when she was too young to understand what she was becoming. I saved the message without responding and returned to my work. The decision could wait. Rebecca would still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. She wasn't going anywhere. Rebecca was utterly alone, and for the first time in her life, she had no one else to blame. Rebecca's text message sat unanswered in my phone while I tried to focus on the demands of running a growing company. We were in the middle of a significant expansion, negotiating contracts that would double our client base and require hiring additional staff. The work was consuming, which was exactly what I needed: something to occupy my mind beyond the wreckage of my family relationships. It was during one of these long working sessions that I discovered something that would shake the foundation of another relationship entirely. I was searching for an old contract template in our company's archived files when I opened a folder that had been misfiled years ago. The folder was labeled with a project code I didn't recognize, tucked into a directory where it clearly didn't belong. Curious, I opened it, expecting to find routine business documents that needed to be sorted into their proper location. Instead, I found Robert's personal notes. The documents were dated from before I had joined his consulting firm Research Files, handwritten memos, printed emails. As I read through them, a picture emerged that made my stomach turn cold. Robert had been searching for anyone connected to my father's name for years before we ever met. The notes detailed his investigation into the Eastbrook trading scandal, his attempts to find evidence that had been destroyed, his frustration at witnesses who had disappeared or refused to cooperate. One memo dated 6 months before Robert had contacted me about my LinkedIn article spelled out his thinking with painful clarity. The daughter may have access to records, may know where evidence is hidden. Family connection could provide leverage or information, worth pursuing. I sat at my desk for a long time, reading and rereading those words. Robert hadn't reached out to me because he was impressed by my article about failure. He hadn't seen my potential or recognized my determination. He had seen my family name and wondered if I could be useful in his decade-long quest for revenge against my father. Everything I had believed about how our relationship began was a lie. The next morning, I walked into Robert's office without an appointment and placed the folder on his desk. He looked at it, then at me, and I watched understanding dawn across his features. He didn't pretend not to know what the documents contained. He didn't try to explain them away or claim they had been taken out of context. He simply sat back in his chair and waited for me to speak. "You found me because of him," I said, my voice steady, despite the anger churning inside me. "Not because of my article, not because of my potential. You saw my family name and thought I might be useful. You wanted to use me to get information about my father, to get revenge for what happened to you at Eastbrook." Robert was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired in a way I had never heard before. "When I first reached out to you, yes. That's exactly what I was thinking." He didn't look away from my eyes as he admitted it. "I had been searching for years for anyone who might help me build a case against the people who destroyed my investment. When I saw your name on that article, I recognized it immediately. I thought you might have access to family records or knowledge about where evidence had been hidden. I thought I could use you to finally get the justice I had been chasing for a decade." "So everything was a manipulation," I said. "The mentorship, the opportunities, the guidance, all of it was just a long game to exploit me." "That's what I intended," Robert acknowledged. "But that's not what happened." He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city skyline with his back to me. "I had a plan when I first contacted you. I would offer mentorship, gain your trust, and eventually steer conversations toward your family's history. I would extract whatever information you had and use it to finally hold your father accountable." He paused. "But something changed within the first month of working with you." "What changed?" Robert turned to face me again. "You did. Or rather, you showed me who you actually were, and it wasn't anything like what I expected." He returned to his chair, sitting down heavily, as if the weight of the confession was physically exhausting. "I expected you to be like your father, someone who would cut corners, make excuses, blame others for failures. That's what I had prepared myself for. Instead, I watched you take complete responsibility for every mistake you made. I watched you refuse shortcuts even when they would have been easier. I watched you build something real through pure determination and ethical practice." "That doesn't excuse what you did." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing excuses the fact that I approached you with manipulative intentions. But I need you to understand that those intentions changed. They changed because you changed them." He leaned forward, his expression more open and vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "Within a few months of working with you, I stopped thinking about how I could use you against your father. I started thinking about how I could help you become the person you were clearly capable of being. You weren't like him at all. You were like me 30 years ago, before disappointment made me cynical, before I started seeing everyone as a potential tool or obstacle." I wanted to reject his explanation, to hold on to the anger that felt cleaner and simpler than the complicated emotions his words were stirring. But I couldn't ignore the years of genuine guidance he had provided, the opportunities he had created, the countless hours he had spent teaching me things that had nothing to do with my father or his revenge. "You had 10 years to pursue this vendetta," I said. "Why didn't you ever ask me about my family? Why didn't you try to extract information?" Robert smiled sadly. "Because by the time I knew you well enough to ask, I didn't want to anymore. You had become more important to me than revenge. You became the daughter I wish I'd had, not because of your family name, but in spite of it. Bringing your father into our relationship would have tainted everything we had built together. I decided that having you in my life mattered more than settling old scores." I sat with his words, feeling the anger slowly transform into something more complicated. He had lied about why he found me. He had approached me with intentions that were selfish and manipulative. But over the years since then, he had been a genuine mentor, a trusted advisor, something close to the father figure I had never had. Could a relationship that began in deception still be worth preserving if it had evolved into something real? "I need time to think about this," I finally said. Robert nodded. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere." I gathered the folder and walked out of his office, my mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. Robert had lied about why he found her, but he hadn't lied about who she had become. I took the folder of Robert's notes home and spent the next week examining everything I thought I knew about our relationship. The revelation had shaken me more deeply than I wanted to admit. Robert had been the closest thing to a father figure I had ever known, someone who believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself, who taught me skills I couldn't have learned anywhere else, who treated my success as something worth nurturing rather than threatening. Learning that his initial interest had been calculated and self-serving felt like discovering a crack in the foundation of a house I had thought was solid. But I was not the same frightened 21-year-old who had walked into that first coffee shop meeting years ago. I had built a company. I had survived my family's dysfunction. I had learned to evaluate evidence rather than react purely from emotion. So instead of making an immediate decision about Robert, I forced myself to analyze our entire working relationship with the same rigor I would apply to a business problem. I started by looking for signs of manipulation or exploitation throughout the years we had worked together. If Robert's original motive had been to use me against my father, surely there would be evidence of that agenda in his subsequent behavior. I examined every opportunity he had offered me, every piece of advice he had given, every decision he had influenced. I searched for strings attached for hidden agendas, for moments when he had steered me toward choices that served his revenge rather than my growth. What I found surprised me. There were no strings. The opportunities Robert had provided, the consulting position, the introductions to potential clients, the guidance through my company's early struggles had all been given freely, with no expectation of anything related to my father in return. He had never once asked me about family documents or financial records. He had never tried to extract information about the Eastbrook case. He had never even mentioned my father's name until the engagement party forced the topic into the open. I examined his advice over the years and found the same pattern. Every piece of guidance had been focused on my development as a business person and as a human being. He had pushed me to take responsibility for my mistakes rather than blame others. He had encouraged me to build something sustainable rather than chase quick profits. He had criticized my work when criticism was warranted, always with the goal of making me better rather than tearing me down. If this was manipulation, it was the strangest manipulation I had ever encountered, one that consistently benefited me while offering Robert nothing but the satisfaction of watching me succeed. I thought about the many moments when Robert could have exploited our relationship and chose not to. He had access to my company's internal operations. He could have used that access to gather information about my father indirectly. He never did. He had influence over my business decisions. He could have steered me toward choices that would have brought me into conflict with my father prematurely. He never did. He had watched my success grow and could have positioned himself to take credit for it. Instead, he consistently ensured that I received recognition for my own achievements, deflecting praise toward me even when his guidance had been crucial. By the end of the week, I had reached a conclusion that was more nuanced than simple forgiveness or condemnation. Robert's original motive had been wrong. He had approached me with the intention of using me, and that intention had been a betrayal of the trust I had placed in him before I knew better. But his subsequent actions had not matched his original motive. Somewhere along the way, he had chosen to become the mentor he had initially only pretended to be. His corruption was at the beginning. His integrity was in everything that followed. I asked Robert to meet me at the same coffee shop where we had first sat together years earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate, returning to the place where our relationship had begun under false pretenses to determine whether it could continue under honest ones. He was already seated when I arrived, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. The week of waiting had clearly taken its toll. I sat down across from him and spoke before he could offer any explanations or apologies. "You came to me for the wrong reasons. That's true, and I won't pretend it doesn't matter." I watched his face as I said the words, saw him absorb them, saw him nod in acceptance, without trying to defend himself. "Your original intention was to use me as a tool for your own revenge. If I had known that at the time, I would never have agreed to work with you. You deceived me about something fundamental." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. "But you stayed for the right reasons," I continued. Whatever you intended at the beginning, what you actually did was teach me, support me, and protect me when you had no obligation to do any of those things. You could have exploited our relationship 100 different ways and you never did. You could have taken credit for my success and you made sure I received recognition instead. Your original motive was corrupt, but your actions over the past 7 years have been consistently good. I paused, organizing my thoughts into the conclusion I had spent all week reaching. I don't need a perfect mentor, Robert. I don't need someone whose intentions were always pure. What I need is someone who chose to do right, even when doing wrong would have been easier, even when doing wrong was what they originally planned. You made that choice. You chose to be the person you pretended to be, and eventually you became that person genuinely. That matters more to me than where you started. Robert's eyes were wet when I finished speaking. He sat very still, as if any movement might shatter the moment. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not, I agreed. But I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because holding on to anger about your original motive would poison everything good that came after. And too much good came after. Too much that I needed. Too much that helped me become who I am. I reached my hand across the table. I needed someone to believe in me when I had no reason to believe in myself. You did that eventually, genuinely. That's enough. Robert looked at my extended hand for a long moment. Then he took it, his grip firm despite the emotion visible on his face. The handshake held for several seconds before he stood abruptly and pulled me into a hug that surprised us both. It was awkward and unexpected, and exactly what we both needed: a physical acknowledgement that our relationship had survived its most serious test. When we separated, Robert wiped his eyes without embarrassment. Thank you, he said simply. I nodded. There was nothing more to say. The past was resolved. The future could begin. With Robert's truth resolved, Jasmine was finally ready to claim her full success publicly. The resolution with Robert lifted a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. For the first time since the engagement party disaster, I felt something approaching peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of clarity about who I was and what mattered to me. My family situation remained complicated. Rebecca's unanswered text still sat in my phone, and the aftermath of my father's public downfall continued to ripple through various social circles. But I had made my choices about how to handle these things, and I was at peace with those choices. Now I could focus on what I had built. The company's initial public offering had been in preparation for months. Robert's team had helped structure the deal, investment bankers had analyzed our financials, lawyers had drafted the necessary documentation. The process was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Countless meetings, endless revisions, the constant awareness that we were approaching a milestone that would transform everything. My small inventory management software had grown into something substantial enough to attract public market investment. The journey from instant noodles in a boarding house to IPO paperwork in a corporate law firm still felt surreal, even as I signed document after document, making it official. The morning of the public offering arrived on a Tuesday in October. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that feels like possibility. I went to my office early before anyone else arrived and sat at my desk watching my computer screen as the markets prepared to open. The numbers that would flash across that screen in the coming hours would determine whether years of sacrifice and determination had translated into something the financial world valued. When trading began, our stock opened at the price the underwriters had set. For a few minutes it held steady while the market assessed this new offering. Then it began to climb. Slowly at first, a few cents at a time, then more rapidly as buyers recognized value and placed orders. I watched the numbers tick upward through the first hour, then the second. By midday, the stock had risen 20% above its opening price. By market close, it had climbed even higher. My phone exploded with notifications throughout the day. Congratulations poured in from investors who had believed in the company early, from clients who felt proud to be associated with our success, from business contacts who suddenly wanted to strengthen relationships they had previously treated as secondary. I responded to messages mechanically, thanking people for their support, while my mind struggled to process what was happening. The numbers on my screen represented my ownership stake in the company I had built. By the time trading ended for the day, those numbers had made me a millionaire on paper. The reality felt strangely distant, as if it were happening to someone else while I watched from far away. I kept expecting to feel something transformative, joy perhaps, or vindication, or the satisfaction of finally arriving at a destination I had been traveling toward for years. Instead, I felt quiet. The girl who had stood on a bridge at 18, empty and alone and ready to disappear, seemed like a character from a story rather than a previous version of myself. The connection between her and the woman sitting in this corner office watching stock prices climb was real, but hard to feel viscerally. Too much had changed. Too much distance had been traveled. In the weeks following the IPO, the business press took notice. Requests for interviews came from publications I had read during my years of self-education, in public libraries, magazines, whose profiles of successful entrepreneurs I had studied, to understand what separated those who made it from those who didn't. I declined most of them. I had no interest in becoming a public figure or having my personal history dissected for entertainment. But I agreed to one carefully selected conversation with a journalist whose work I respected, someone known for thoughtful profiles rather than sensational headlines. The interview took place in my office, which remained modest despite the company's success. I had never felt the need for expensive furniture or impressive views. The journalist noticed this and asked about it, and I explained that I had spent too many years without resources to feel comfortable wasting them on appearances. She nodded and wrote something in her notebook, then moved to the question that everyone seemed to want answered. What's your secret to success? I thought about the question for a moment before responding. The easy answer would have been something about hard work or determination, generic inspirational language that meant nothing because it applied to everyone. The honest answer was more complicated. I had nothing to lose, I finally said. For most people, that sounds like a disadvantage, like a problem to be overcome. For me, it was freedom. I couldn't fall back on family connections or inherited money. I had no safety net, no backup plan, no one who would catch me if I fell. Every decision I made had to be right because I couldn't afford to be wrong. I paused, organizing the thoughts into something coherent. That pressure either breaks you or builds you. There's no middle ground. Either you collapse under the weight of knowing that failure means disaster, or you develop the ability to think clearly under that weight, to make good decisions even when you're terrified, to keep moving forward even when every instinct says to give up. I shrugged. I got lucky. The pressure built me instead of breaking me, but I don't think that makes me special. I think it just means I survived something that a lot of people survive, and I happened to survive it in a direction that led somewhere good. The quote circulated widely after the article was published. I saw it shared on social media, referenced in other interviews, repeated by people who recognized something in those words that resonated with their own experiences. I had not intended to become an inspirational figure, but the story of someone who started with nothing and built something substantial apparently touched a nerve in a world where so many people felt trapped by their circumstances. The Industry Association nominated me for Young Entrepreneur of the Year 2 months after the IPO. The ceremony was held at a hotel ballroom filled with executives, investors, and business leaders, the same type of crowd that had filled my sister's engagement party, though this time I was the reason they had gathered. I wore a simple dress, nothing ostentatious, and tried to ignore the strangeness of being celebrated by people who would have ignored me completely a few years earlier. When my name was announced as the winner, I walked to the podium and looked out at the audience. Some of the faces were familiar. Robert was there, beaming with undisguised pride. Some were strangers who knew me only through my company's reputation. And some, I realized with a small shock, were people who had dismissed me, ignored me, or actively doubted my potential in years past. They were applauding now, but I remembered their skepticism. I kept my acceptance speech brief. Long speeches at award ceremonies served the speaker's ego more than the audience's interest, and I had never been comfortable with extended public attention. 10 years ago, I owned nothing but a bus ticket out of my hometown. I said, my voice steady in the quiet ballroom. "Tonight, I own a company that helps thousands of small businesses succeed. The difference between that girl and this woman wasn't talent. I'm not exceptionally gifted at anything. It wasn't luck. Plenty of unlucky things happened along the way. The difference was a decision. The decision to keep going when stopping would have been easier. The decision to get up every time I got knocked down. The decision to believe that the future could be different from the past, even when the past seemed like all there was." I looked directly at the audience, knowing that some of them were in their own struggles, their own dark nights, their own moments of wondering whether any of it was worth continuing. If you're watching this, and you're still in your bus ticket phase, still at the beginning, still wondering if you'll ever get anywhere, I want you to know something. The distance between where you are and where you want to be is just time and persistence. That's all. Keep going. The road is long, but it leads somewhere, I promise. The applause that followed was warm and sustained. I returned to my seat, accepted congratulations from the people around me, and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. I had done something real. I had built something that mattered. I had proven that the family who dismissed me had been wrong about what I was capable of. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out discreetly, expecting another congratulations message, and felt my blood turn to ice. The message was from a hospital. Mother had been admitted to the emergency room. Her condition was serious. But in the middle of her greatest triumph, Jasmine's phone buzzed with news that stopped her cold. Mother had been hospitalized. I left the awards ceremony immediately, barely pausing to make apologies to the people who wanted to continue congratulating me. Robert saw my face as I hurried toward the exit and asked if everything was okay. I told him I would explain later and kept moving. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes that felt like hours, my mind cycling through possibilities I didn't want to examine too closely. Whatever my feelings about my mother, whatever she had done or failed to do, the news of her hospitalization had triggered something primal, a response that bypassed all the years of estrangement and resentment. The hospital was one of the better facilities in the city, the kind of place where private rooms came with comfortable chairs and windows overlooking carefully maintained gardens. I gave my name at the reception desk and was directed to the 3rd floor. As I walked through the corridors, I tried to prepare myself for what I might find. The message had said her condition was serious, but serious covered a wide range of possibilities from temporary crisis to imminent death. A nurse intercepted me outside the room and explained the situation. My mother had collapsed at home 2 days earlier and had been brought in by ambulance. The diagnosis was severe exhaustion compounded by stress-related illness. Her body had simply given out under the accumulated weight of too many years carrying too many secrets. She was stable now, but weak, and the doctors were monitoring her closely. The nurse mentioned with careful neutrality that family visits had been limited. I understood from her tone that this was a polite way of saying almost no one had come. I asked about other visitors. The nurse checked her notes. My father had come once, stayed approximately 15 minutes, then left saying he had business matters that required his attention. He had not returned. Rebecca had called the nursing station but hadn't visited in person. According to the message she had left, she was dealing with her own situation and couldn't handle seeing our mother in this condition. The nurse delivered this information without judgment, but I could see the assessment in her eyes. A woman was lying alone in a hospital room, and the family that should have been surrounding her had largely abandoned her. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. My mother looked smaller than I had ever seen her. The woman who had loomed so large in my childhood, fears whose silence had been a weapon, whose favoritism had shaped my understanding of my own worth, was now a fragile figure dwarfed by hospital equipment and crisp white sheets. Her eyes were closed when I entered, but they opened at the sound of my footsteps. When she saw me standing there, tears began flowing immediately, tracing wet paths down cheeks that seemed thinner than they should have been. "You came," she whispered, her voice weak and scratchy. "I didn't think you would." I sat in the chair beside her bed, positioning myself close enough to talk, but not close enough to touch. The distance was deliberate. I was here, but I was not offering the comfort of physical presence. "I came because no one should die alone," I said. "That doesn't mean I've forgiven you." Mother nodded slowly, accepting the terms I had established. She didn't argue or plead or try to convince me that she deserved better. Perhaps she was too weak for that kind of effort, or perhaps she had finally accepted that some debts cannot be repaid no matter how much time passes. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of hospital activity beyond the closed door. I looked at my mother and tried to reconcile this diminished figure with the memories I carried, the woman who had sat with Rebecca every evening while I struggled alone, who had praised my sister while ignoring my achievements, who had stayed silent while my father's cruelty shaped my childhood. Then Mother reached under her pillow and pulled out something I didn't expect, a worn bank book, its cover softened by years of handling. She held it toward me with a trembling hand. "I've been keeping this since you were 10 years old," she said. "Money I saved secretly separate from everything your father controlled, a little bit at a time whenever I could manage without him noticing. I always told myself it was for you, for your future, for when you needed it." She paused, her voice breaking. "But really, I kept it hidden because I was afraid. If you had money, you would have options. If you had options, you might leave. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself from losing you." I looked at the bank book without taking it. The cover was worn at the edges, creased from being hidden and retrieved countless times over the years. Inside those pages was a record of deposits made over 15 years' money that could have changed everything for me if I had known it existed. Money that could have paid for SAT prep classes. Money that could have helped me get into college. Money that could have given me choices beyond instant noodles and double shifts and sleeping in bus stations. "You were right," I said, my voice flat. "If I had known this existed, I would have left sooner. I would have had options. I might not have stood on that bridge." Mother's face crumpled with the weight of understanding what her hoarding had nearly cost. She knew about the bridge now I had mentioned it in interviews that had circulated widely enough for even an estranged parent to encounter. She knew that her daughter had stood at the edge of ending everything alone in a strange city with no resources and no hope. And she knew that the money hidden under her pillow could have prevented that moment. "I know," she whispered, her tears flowing freely now. "I know what I did. I know what I almost caused. I told myself so many lies about why I was keeping it secret. I told myself you weren't ready, that you would waste it, that I was waiting for the right moment. But there was never going to be a right moment, because the real reason was that I couldn't bear to give you the power to leave me. And you left anyway. You left with nothing and you nearly died, and I kept this hidden the whole time." I reached out and took the bank book from her trembling hand. I opened it and looked at the balance, a sum that would have been life-changing to an 18-year-old with a suitcase and a bus ticket. Not a fortune by any standard, but enough. Enough for a security deposit on a real apartment. Enough for community college classes. Enough to not stand on a bridge in the middle of the night wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared. I placed the bank book in my purse and stood up. "You didn't lose me," I said, looking down at my mother's tear-streaked face. "You never had me. Not really. You had custody. You had the legal right to keep me in your house and feed me and clothe me. But you never had my love because you never gave me yours. You gave everything to Rebecca and left me with scraps, and now you're surprised that I didn't stay to fight for more." Mother opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could speak. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to understand what actually happened between us. You made choices every single day for 18 years. You could have been different at any point. You could have stood up for me, spoken up for me, made room for me. You chose not to. This—" I gestured at the hospital room, at her diminished state, at the empty chairs where family should have been sitting. "This is what those choices built." I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. "I hope you recover. I genuinely do. But I'm not going to pretend that we have a relationship to rebuild. We never had one in the first place." I left the room without looking back. At the administrative desk, I stopped and asked for the billing department. When they connected me, I gave them my credit card information and instructed them to charge all of my mother's medical expenses to my account. Everything. The room, the doctors, the medication, whatever she needed until she was discharged. The administrator seemed surprised. "Are you sure, ma'am? The costs could be substantial." "I'm sure," I said. "Just don't tell her who paid." Jasmine left the hospital without looking back, but she paid the bill in full before she left. The visit to my mother's hospital bed left me emotionally drained in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had said what needed to be said, drawn boundaries that needed to be drawn, and walked away with the bank book that represented years of secrets and selfishness. But the encounter had stirred up memories I usually kept locked away, particularly the memory of that night on the bridge, when I had been closer to disappearing than anyone except one stranger had ever known. 2 days after leaving the hospital, I received a call from the private investigator I had hired 3 years earlier. His voice carried an unusual note of emotion when he delivered his report. He had finally found what I had been searching for. The old woman's name was Mrs. Chen. She had sold sticky rice from her cart for over 40 years, moving through various locations in the city as neighborhoods changed and foot traffic shifted. She had raised 2 children as a widow, working 7 days a week, pushing that cart through streets and alleys, supporting her family through decades of early mornings and late nights. Her sticky rice had been famous in certain circles, regular customers who sought her out wherever she relocated, who knew that her recipe had been passed down through 3 generations. She had passed away 11 months earlier peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. The investigator's voice softened as he delivered this news, understanding what it meant to me. I had spent 3 years searching for this woman, hoping to thank her properly for what she had done, and I had missed her by less than a year. But there was more. Mrs. Chen had left behind a granddaughter named Lily, who had inherited the sticky rice recipe but chosen a different path. She worked as an elementary school teacher in a district that served low-income families. The investigator had contacted Lily to explain why someone had been searching for her grandmother, and she had agreed to meet with me if I wanted. He provided her contact information with a note. She seemed moved that someone remembered her grandmother after all these years. I called Lily that afternoon and arranged to meet her at a small tea house. She suggested a quiet place where her grandmother had sometimes taken breaks during long working days. I arrived early and ordered tea. I didn't drink, my hands trembling slightly as I waited. I had imagined this meeting for years, though I had always pictured it with Mrs. Chen herself. Now I would have to settle for honoring her memory through her granddaughter. Lily arrived precisely on time. She was a quiet woman in her early 30s with gentle eyes and the kind of composed demeanor that probably served her well in a classroom full of children. I had brought flowers for the altar she kept for her grandmother, a traditional arrangement that the tea house owner helped me select. Lily accepted them with a small bow of gratitude, her expression warm but curious. We sat across from each other in a private corner of the tea house, and I began explaining why I had been searching for her grandmother for 3 years. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the memories I had kept carefully contained began spilling out. I was standing on a bridge 7 years ago. I said, my voice steady, even as my hands continued to tremble around my teacup. It was my first night in this city. I had left home with nothing. I had nowhere to sleep. I didn't know anyone. I was 18 years old, and I had decided that disappearing would be easier than continuing. I paused, forcing myself to say the next part clearly. I wasn't planning to climb down from that railing. Lily's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. She listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that this story needed to be told completely. Your grandmother stopped her cart on that bridge, I continued. She didn't ask me what I was doing there. She didn't lecture me or threaten to call the police or demand that I explain myself. She just asked if I had eaten. I felt my throat tighten around the memory. That's all she did. She asked a simple question and offered me sticky rice. And somehow I still don't fully understand how that was enough. That small act of kindness from a complete stranger made me want to stay alive. Lily was crying silently now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened. She didn't wipe them away or try to compose herself. She just let them fall while I finished my story. I climbed down from that railing because your grandmother cared whether I had eaten, because she treated me like a person worth feeding, worth noticing, worth a moment of her time. I never got her name, I never saw her again, but I have thought about her every single day for 7 years. I built a company. I became successful. And the whole time I knew that none of it would have happened if she hadn't stopped her cart that night. When I finished speaking, Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of connection that I accepted gratefully. "Grandmother talked about you sometimes," Lily said, her voice thick with emotion. "She never knew your name, but she remembered you. She called you the bridge girl. Every few months she would mention you. She would say, 'I hope that girl is eating better now. I hope she found somewhere warm to sleep.' Every New Year when we prayed for blessings on people we loved, she included you, a stranger she met once on a bridge. She never forgot you." I couldn't speak. The tears I had held back for years through the struggles and successes, through the family confrontations and business triumphs, finally broke free. I sat in that tea house and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the night Mrs. Chen had given me sticky rice and saved my life without knowing it. When I finally recovered enough to speak, I told Lily about what I wanted to do. I was creating a charitable foundation dedicated to providing meals and crisis support for young people who had nowhere else to turn. Emergency food services, temporary housing assistance, mental health resources for those standing on their own metaphorical bridges. The foundation would be called the Mrs. Chen Fund, and its mission would be simple: to extend the kindness that one old woman had shown me to others who needed it just as desperately. Lily listened to my plans with fresh tears streaming down her face. When I finished, she squeezed my hand tightly. "Grandmother would have been so proud," she whispered. "She always said that small kindnesses ripple outward in ways we never see. She never imagined her ripples would reach this far. Some people save lives without ever knowing it, and some lives honor that debt by saving others." The Mrs. Chen Fund launched 3 months after my meeting with Lily. We started small partnerships with local shelters, a crisis hotline staffed by trained counselors, a network of restaurants willing to provide meals to young people who showed up with nowhere else to go. The foundation grew faster than I had anticipated, fueled by donations from people who had read about its mission and recognized something in the story of a stranger's kindness saving a life. Every dollar we raised, every meal we provided, every young person we helped step back from their own metaphorical bridge, all of it honored the memory of a woman who had asked a simple question on a cold night and changed everything. While I was building something that gave me genuine pride, my father's world was collapsing entirely. The lawsuit he had filed against me had been his last desperate gamble, and losing it had cost him everything he had left. The legal fees consumed most of his remaining savings money he had expected to recover through damages he would never receive. When the judge ordered him to pay my legal costs as well, the financial damage became catastrophic. He had bet everything on being able to silence me through the courts, and the courts had sided with truth instead. His professional reputation, already severely damaged by the circulating fraud documents, was now completely destroyed. The lawsuit had drawn public attention to a story that might otherwise have faded from memory. News outlets that wouldn't have covered a quiet blacklisting were happy to report on a father suing his successful daughter and losing spectacularly. The coverage was not sympathetic. Journalists dug into the Eastbrook bankruptcy records and found exactly what I had shared: evidence of fraud that explained why HR departments had been quietly declining his applications for months. No legitimate company would hire him now. The industry he had spent his career in was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and everyone now knew about him. He attempted to reinvent himself, starting a consulting business that would leverage his decades of experience to help smaller companies navigate challenges he understood well. But word had spread too thoroughly. The contacts he reached out to politely declined. The potential clients he approached discovered his history during routine due diligence. No one would risk their own reputation by associating with someone so thoroughly exposed. The house went on the market 6 months after the lawsuit. I learned about it through Robert, who had heard from someone in real estate that a property matching my childhood home's description was being sold under circumstances that suggested financial distress. I verified it myself, finding the listing online with photographs that stirred memories. I had tried to forget the living room, where I had been ignored, the kitchen, where I had worked, while Rebecca entertained guests, the bedroom, where I had lain awake, wondering why I wasn't enough. Looking at those photographs, I felt something unexpected. Nothing. The house that had represented my father's success, his authority, his power over our family, it was just rooms now. Furniture that strangers would buy at estate sales. Walls that would be repainted by new owners who knew nothing of what had happened within them. The physical structure of my childhood was being dismantled and sold piece by piece, and I discovered that I didn't care. The house had never been my home. It had been a place where I lived until I could escape. The call came on a Thursday afternoon several weeks after the house sale had been finalized. I was in my office reviewing quarterly projections when my assistant informed me that a man claiming to be my father was on the line. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether to accept the call. Curiosity won over reluctance. I told her to put him through. The voice that came through the phone sounded nothing like the commanding presence I remembered from childhood. My father had always spoken with absolute confidence, as if his opinions were facts and his judgments were final verdicts. Now his voice was thin and uncertain, the voice of a man who had lost everything and was about to ask for something he had no right to request. "Jasmine," he said, my name sounding strange in his mouth after so many years. "I need to talk to you." "Then talk," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. There was a long pause filled with the sound of his breathing. When he finally spoke, the words came slowly, as if each one cost him tremendous effort. "I need help. Things have gotten difficult. The house is gone. My savings are gone. No one will hire me." Another pause. "I need money, just enough to get back on my feet, to find an apartment to survive until I can figure something out." I listened without interrupting, letting him lay out his request completely. He explained his situation in more detail than necessary, perhaps hoping that the magnitude of his desperation would move me to sympathy. He mentioned that he had tried everything else, that he had no other options, that he was facing homelessness if something didn't change soon. "You can afford it now," he said finally, his voice dropping to something approaching a plea. "What I'm asking for wouldn't even matter to you. It's nothing compared to what you have. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for help." When he finished, I sat in silence for a moment, considering how to respond. This man had never acknowledged me, never supported me, never loved me. He had spent 25 years punishing me for the crime of existing, for being the evidence of my mother's betrayal. He had told me I was worthless, talentless, destined to fail. He had watched me leave at 18 with nothing and hadn't bothered to come after me. "You told me my entire childhood that I wasn't good enough," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You told me I had no talent, no potential, no future. Every time I achieved something, you dismissed it. Every time I needed encouragement, you gave me criticism instead. You told me I would fail at everything I tried." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "You were wrong about all of it." He started to respond, but I continued before he could speak. "But here's what you were most wrong about. You thought I would always be someone you could dismiss, someone who would always need you more than you needed her, someone who would come crawling back, eventually desperate for the approval you would never give." I took a breath. "That's not true anymore. It hasn't been true for years. I don't need you. I don't need your approval. I don't need anything from you at all. Jasmine, please." "Goodbye," I said, and hung up the phone. I sat in my office for a long time after that call, waiting to feel something, guilt perhaps, or satisfaction, or the vindictive pleasure of turning away someone who had turned away from me so many times. But what I felt instead was simply peace. I had said what needed to be said. I had closed a door that should have been closed years ago. And I had proven finally and completely that I was no longer the invisible girl who needed her father's love to know her own worth. Father had spent 25 years making Jasmine feel worthless, and in the end he discovered she was the only one who could have saved him. The phone call with my father marked the end of any connection I had with the man who had raised me. I didn't regret the decision to refuse his request. He had spent decades treating me as worthless, and I felt no obligation to rescue him from consequences he had earned through his own choices. But I found myself thinking about the broader wreckage of my family in the weeks that followed, the scattered pieces of what had once been a household, now dispersed across different locations and different stages of collapse. My mother remained in the hospital for several weeks before being transferred to a rehabilitation facility. I continued paying her medical bills anonymously, not out of forgiveness, but out of a sense that certain cruelties were beneath me. She would recover eventually, though what kind of life she would recover remained unclear. My father had apparently moved into a small apartment somewhere supported by whatever remained after the house sale and whatever assistance programs he qualified for. I didn't know the details and didn't seek them out. Rebecca's situation, I learned through various channels, had become increasingly desperate. The collapse of her life happened systematically, each pillar falling in sequence until nothing remained to support her. Her job was the first casualty. The company she worked for had tolerated her family drama, initially treating it as personal business that didn't affect her professional performance. But as the scandal grew, the lawsuit, the social media disaster, the public exposure of fraud connected to her family name, her employers reconsidered their position. They couldn't afford the reputational risk of association with someone whose name had become synonymous with family dysfunction and public humiliation. She was let go with a generous severance package and vague references to restructuring, but everyone understood the real reason. The friends who had surrounded Rebecca during her successful years vanished with remarkable speed once she had nothing to offer them. These were people who had valued her for her connections, her social capital, her ability to secure invitations to the right events and introductions to the right people. When those assets evaporated, so did their interest. Her phone, which had once buzzed constantly with messages and invitations, went silent for days at a time. The group chats that had included her fell quiet or continued without her participation. Social media, which had been her primary tool for maintaining her personal brand, became a minefield of reminders about what she had lost. Daniel's wedding made the society pages 3 months after he had abandoned Rebecca via text message. The photographs showed him smiling beside the venture capitalist's daughter, a woman younger and wealthier than Rebecca, better connected to the worlds Daniel wanted to inhabit. The ceremony had been lavish, the guest list exclusive, the coverage glowing. Rebecca saw these photos while sitting alone in an apartment she could barely afford, eating takeout she had paid for with a credit card she knew she would struggle to pay off. The contrast between what her life had been and what it had become couldn't have been more stark. She tried to rebuild. I learned this through Robert's network, which occasionally picked up information about my sister's attempts to find employment. She applied for jobs that matched her qualifications, positions similar to what she had held before the scandal. But the internet had preserved her social media attack on me, and hiring managers found it during routine background searches. The post she had deleted was archived in countless screenshots shared across platforms permanently attached to her digital identity. Interviews that seemed promising ended abruptly when employers discovered her history. She was too controversial for corporate environments that valued stability and avoided drama. She was too much baggage for startups that couldn't afford negative attention during critical growth phases. She was too risky for established firms that had learned to be cautious about candidates with complicated public profiles. The personal brand she had spent years cultivating, successful, connected, respectable, the golden daughter of a respectable family, had been replaced by something else entirely. She was now known as the woman who had publicly attacked her more successful sister and lost spectacularly, the woman whose family had collapsed amid fraud accusations and lawsuit failures. There was no escaping her own history. The internet remembers everything, and what it remembered about Rebecca was not flattering. Every search of her name brought up the scandal. Every potential employer who did their due diligence found reasons to choose someone else. The doors that had once opened automatically for her because of her family's reputation, her social connections, her careful self-presentation were now firmly closed. I didn't take pleasure in Rebecca's suffering, though I might have expected to. She had hurt me for years, had attacked me publicly, had tried to destroy my reputation to protect her own narrative. But watching her life collapse from a distance, I felt mostly a weary sadness. She had been shaped by the same family dysfunction that had shaped me, molded by pressures she hadn't chosen and expectations she hadn't understood. Her cruelty toward me had been wrong, but it hadn't emerged from nowhere. It had been cultivated by parents who had used us both as instruments of their own damaged agendas. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by postal mail rather than email or text message. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, Rebecca's careful cursive, which I had seen on countless birthday cards and Christmas presents throughout our childhood. The sight of it stirred something in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten clearly, the product of considerable effort. I could see where certain words had been written carefully, where the pressure of the pen had varied as she struggled to express herself. This wasn't a quick note dashed off in a moment of emotion. This was something she had worked on, thought about, probably drafted multiple times before settling on the version I held in my hands. The letter didn't explain, or excuse, or justify anything. It didn't rehash the past or attempt to rewrite history. It simply asked a question. Can we talk not as sisters? I know I lost that right long ago, just as two people. I need to say some things out loud, and you're the only person left who would understand why they matter. I read those words several times, turning them over in my mind. Rebecca was asking for a conversation, nothing more. She wasn't demanding forgiveness or expecting reconciliation. She was simply asking to be heard by someone who shared her history, who understood the context of her choices, even if they couldn't excuse them. I set the letter aside without responding immediately. This decision required thought. Rebecca had hurt me deeply repeatedly for years, but she was also alone now, stripped of everything she had used to define herself, facing the consequences of choices she had made when she was too young to understand what she was becoming. The question wasn't whether I wanted to help her. The question was whether talking to her would help either of us, or whether it would simply reopen wounds that time was slowly healing. For the first time in her life, Rebecca had nothing left to offer, only the truth about who she had become and why. I kept Rebecca's letter on my desk for a week before making a decision. Every day I would look at it, read those careful handwritten words again, and weigh the risks against the potential benefits of agreeing to meet her. Part of me wanted to simply throw it away, to close this chapter of my life completely and never look back. But another part recognized that some doors need to be closed properly rather than simply abandoned, that walking away without a final word can leave loose threads that unravel over time. I sent Rebecca a brief message agreeing to meet. I chose a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us had any connection to, neutral territory, where we could talk without the weight of shared history pressing down on every word. The location was public enough that neither of us would feel trapped, casual enough that we could leave whenever we wanted without causing a scene. I wasn't offering reconciliation. I was offering closure for both of us. Rebecca was already seated when I arrived. The transformation in her appearance stopped me for a moment just inside the door. The polished woman from the engagement party designer gown, borrowed diamonds, perfectly styled hair, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. Her clothes were simple and slightly worn. Her makeup was minimal, revealing the dark circles under her eyes. The expensive jewelry was absent, replaced by nothing at all. She looked tired and old, in a way that had nothing to do with the actual passage of years and everything to do with the weight of accumulated losses. I sat down across from her and ordered coffee for both of us, without asking what she wanted. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. I waited for her to speak first. This meeting had been her request. She needed to begin it. Nearly a minute passed before Rebecca found her voice. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully, as if she had rehearsed them many times, but still wasn't sure she could deliver them properly. "I want you to know that I remember," she said. "I remember being your sister, not the person I became later, the real sister from before everything got twisted." Her eyes met mine, and I saw genuine pain there, not performance. "I remember fighting Hannah because she made you cry. I remember sneaking you cookies from the kitchen when Mom sent you to bed without dinner because you had talked back. I remember holding your hand during thunderstorms because you were scared and wouldn't admit it. I remember actually loving you, Jasmine, really loving you the way sisters are supposed to." Her voice broke on the last words, and she paused to compose herself. I remained silent, giving her space to continue. "Mom told me when I was 12 that I had to always be the best, that everything depended on me, that I couldn't afford to let you catch up, to let you succeed, to let you shine. She never explained why. She never told me about her secrets about Rebecca being my real father, about any of it. I was just a kid. I believed her because she was my mother, and I thought mothers told the truth." Rebecca's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "And I spent the next 15 years becoming someone I don't recognize anymore, someone cruel. Someone who could look at her own sister struggling and feel satisfaction instead of compassion. Someone who could attack you publicly and convince herself she was the victim." She stopped, seemingly unable to continue. The confession had cost her something fundamental, some last reserve of denial that had been protecting her from the full weight of what she had done. I listened to everything she said without interrupting. When she finished, I took a moment to organize my response. This conversation mattered not because it would change anything between us, but because the words I chose would be the last words we ever exchanged. They needed to be honest without being cruel, final without being vindictive. "I believe you remember loving me," I said carefully. "I even believe you might still love me in whatever way you're capable of loving anyone at this point. Those memories you described, Hannah, the cookies, the thunderstorms, I remember them too. They were real. The sister you used to be was real." Rebecca's eyes brightened slightly, perhaps hoping this acknowledgement was the beginning of reconciliation. I continued before that hope could take root. "But understanding why you became cruel doesn't undo the cruelty. Knowing you were manipulated by Mom doesn't heal the wounds you inflicted. You had choices, Rebecca. Every day for 15 years you had the choice to be different, to question what Mom was telling you, to see me as a person instead of a threat. You chose not to. Those choices were yours regardless of what influenced them." I watched the hope fade from her eyes, replaced by something more complicated, acceptance perhaps, or the beginning of it. "I'm not saying this to punish you," I continued. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you need to hear the truth from someone who was there. Mom manipulated you. Dad ignored you. The family we grew up in was broken in ways neither of us understood until it was too late. None of that excuses what you did to me, but it does explain it. And maybe understanding the explanation can help you figure out how to move forward." I stood up, preparing to leave. But before I walked away, I paused and said one more thing, something I had learned through years of struggle and therapy and the slow work of rebuilding myself from nothing. "I've done something in the last few years that I want you to consider. I forgave myself for believing I was worthless when they told me I was, for accepting the way they treated me instead of fighting back, for standing on that bridge and nearly letting them win." I looked directly into my sister's eyes. I stopped punishing myself for being a victim of people who should have protected me. Maybe you should try the same thing. Not for my sake, for yours. You were a victim too, Rebecca. A different kind, but a victim nonetheless. Punishing yourself forever won't fix anything. It will just extend their victory over both of us. I placed money on the table to cover the coffee. "Goodbye, Rebecca. I genuinely hope you find peace. I hope you build a life that makes you happy. But I won't be part of it." That chapter is closed. I walked out of the coffee shop into bright afternoon sunlight. The city surrounded me with its noise and energy traffic and construction and ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that a 30-year story had just reached its conclusion at a corner table behind them. I didn't look back through the window at Rebecca still sitting there. I didn't check my phone for messages. I simply walked to my car, started the engine, and pulled out into traffic. The rearview mirror showed the coffee shop growing smaller behind me. I adjusted it slightly, and for just a moment my own reflection filled the glass. A woman who had survived things that should have destroyed her, who had built something meaningful from nothing, who had finally learned that her worth didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. I returned my eyes to the road ahead. I had spent 18 years being invisible in that family. I had spent 12 more years proving I existed without them. Now I finally understood what freedom actually meant. It wasn't success, though I had achieved that. It wasn't revenge, though justice had been served. It wasn't validation from people who had hurt me, though they had finally seen what I was capable of. Freedom was simply this, the ability to walk away without looking back. Not because I hated them, because I no longer needed them to see me. I had finally learned to see myself. And that was Jasmine's story, a girl who was invisible in her own home, who stood on a bridge ready to disappear, who built an empire from nothing, and learned that the greatest revenge is simply becoming whole. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who should have loved you most? Have you ever had to walk away from family to find yourself? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let others know they are not alone. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. Every subscription helps us bring more stories like Jasmine's to people who need to hear them. Thank you for staying until the end. Until next time, remember, your worth is not determined by those who failed to see it.